Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, and for this one, I am joined by Jasun Horsley, who is a writer, researcher. I mean, these terms are just very general, obviously, but as you'll see in the episode, we'll get into specific areas. I would say things like the occult at certain points in time, psychedelics, let's say influential figures within these spaces. And so, one area I want to start with here, Jasun, is if people have read your work, one thing actually I noticed from the earlier days when you had your aliases, people maybe back then didn't know who the real person behind the work was. And so at the time, I actually feel like early on, correct me if I'm wrong, but when did your actual connection with your brother, who was obviously a much more public-facing figure, if people don't know, was sort of, I mean, the polite way to say it is like a raconteur or something. I would essentially say for young people nowadays, just think of like a scene figure, someone within certain spaces. You could have a music space or a cultural space who's at all the parties and knows all the people. Was it actually something earlier in your career? Were you intentionally trying to be anonymous? Did people know early on that this was you were actually the brother of this other person who was famous in his own right? How much of your early career was kind of like anonymized?
It's the first time I've had that question in reference to my brother, or maybe at all. And the timeline may be significant because my brother wasn't a celebrity for very long before he died. So it was maybe a 5-year period. It was really dandy in the underworld. Well, the crucifixion, let's say, if we want to start there, for those who don't know, he's crucified in the Philippines in a genuine ritual that they do over there in the year 2000 when I turned 33. And that was the same year that I published The Blood Poets. I hadn't thought of this correspondence, actually, but The Blood Poets was not written anonymously.
Oh, right.
So I had no thought about being anonymous per se, but what was going on even prior to that period, such as in my internet, when I first had an internet presence, I also had a pseudonym, Jason Wind, spelt with a Y, as well as writing on the internet under what I went by J. Horsley back then. And I separated these two identities intentionally as for two different forms of communication. One was to do with film, my writings about film, and my aspirations to become a filmmaker, and the other was my explorations of the esoteric. And so I had this conscious intention early on to keep those two separate, because I thought that the esoteric, occult, conspiracy theorizing, public identity would what he was doing, what I was doing under that name, would sabotage potentially what I was trying to achieve under the other name. So you're not a million miles away in the terms that there was a very clear worldly desire to retain anonymity, but it wasn't directly connected to my brother, or it was connected to the world in which he became a celebrity.
I see. Actually, a question I did have about your brother, though, is I just wanted to ask this, which is when you talk about obviously some of the conspiratorial areas you've delved into and some of the theories you've summarized or talked about in your work over the years, he was at the minimum on the fringes of these. And oftentimes, if you think of the people he was potentially rubbing shoulders with and the kinds of parties he might be involved in, maybe he even was directly around these things and had some sense of them. I know you've talked previously about like you never really had like a super close relationships like you would have in discussions about these things, and maybe he just alluded to them. Do you actually get the sense this is going to have a slightly different take than maybe where that sounded like it's going? I'm not going to ask was he involved with these things. What I want to ask was this: is that whole world is just drenched in the occult and in esoterica. And so even people who maybe come from, I mean, he seemed like a sensualist, maybe he was a materialist, I'm not sure. People like that might just say, oh, it's just the window dressing, it's just the theme that they choose, or it's just some spooky thing old people do. Did he actually have any kind of a sense of the occult about him? Like, did he actually believe in spirits or external forces, or did he actually have any sense that maybe some of these circles he moved in really did think that was a real thing and it wasn't just kind of like LARPing, as it were?
He identified as a nihilist a lot, like he really identified as being a nihilist, and that included being fiercely, ferociously derogatory, or I think the word is more than skeptical, dismissive of anything like that, particularly with me. However, this is inseparable from the fact that he did acknowledge was in his teenage years when he was first becoming a musician before he became a painter and a sculptor and then painter. Actually, it was in that order, and other things, and a libertine. Even I don't think he was a libertine in his teen years or even aspiring particularly. He was involved in some sort of occult circle, specifically Genesis P-Orridge. I don't know how. I don't think they were close, and I think Dave Tibet of Current 93. I'm not sure when he met him.
Oh, right.
But he definitely hung out with a number of different people who went on to become known for their interest in the occult. And at least in the case of Dave Tibet, he retained close relations, even friendship with him. So for me, his cynicism or his dismissive attitude towards the occult, contempt is really the word,
right?
For anyone who believed in the occult or practiced it, that he expressed to me, it had to do with some sort of involvement that he didn't want to, some way of being burned, I think.
Oh, it was like denial, you think?
Well, certainly denial. There was certainly denial, and he would, in his lucid moments, he would admit that he was pushing against something,
right,
in order not to get sucked into some blind belief in it. So he was a spiritual person, to use that rather vague word. He was. I mean, you don't get crucified unless you're
sure.
Really deeply seeking some sort of spiritual meaning. He didn't just do it as a publicity stunt. So he wasn't exactly anti God. He had this saying, even if God exists, I wouldn't believe in him, something like that.
Okay.
So it was a conscious thing, like I defy God, I deny God, combined with a sense that there was certainly a reality. For example, he subscribed to astrology, he didn't practice it per se, but he referred to it a lot, he absolutely believed in it. So that was a complete odds to his snide dismissal and contempt of and for practitioners of the occult or religious people. Like, he was superstitious, if you like, or he was aware of, hidden dimensions and metaphysical realities. But whatever his attitude, his public attitude, it was doubled or squared with me. Like, any whiff he got from me, he would be down on me like a ton of bricks. And particularly with conspiracy stuff. Like, I don't know if there was even any. Well, I guess you can't separate the two, but. So maybe he also got burned in some way in relation to that, but he was very derogatory about any kind of suggestions I would ever make that that there was conspiratorial forces at work in the world. It seemed, in many ways, he seemed and talked and acted like an ignorant person around that. There are even YouTube videos of him dismissing sex trafficking of women as a guardian myth kind of thing. So you're really weirdly naive or fiercely resistant to and rejecting of a certain aspect of the world, that you could say that although he proclaimed to despise the world, he despised it for its mundane dreariness, not for its political or spiritual corruption. He embraced certain aspects of that, and himself wanted to become. I think he said himself, he wanted to become like the beast. As much as he could, which is a path of transgression. That is occultism. It is an aspect of occultism. So I don't know to this day, and probably will never know, how much of it he was actually practicing consciously and therefore denying it, and how much he denied it because he had contempt for any kind of joining any kind of system, and yet he himself was embodying certain of those principles.
I notice whenever you speak about him, it's often like you just did there, in contrast, like things that are different about you from him. And certainly if people read your work, they would probably get the sense that he seems like, at least this is what he projects, a very gregarious, outgoing figure who wants the external stimuli, whereas you come across as more of the sort of bookish, scholarly younger brother who's interested in these totally other topics he's not into. But one thing I wanted to ask was, is there a similarity between the two of you? And perhaps maybe you can extend this further. I don't know if this is a family trait, but when you're talking there about some of the extreme things he did and some of the ways, I mean, even with his public persona, how he wanted it to be so particularly coloured and bright and in a certain way. I notice in your work, a lot of your work has been sort of diving in with both feet into totally different areas, whether that might be some of the figures we're going to talk about later, Castaneda, or later on like the alien abduction or conspiracy stuff. It seems like whatever you do as well, you do it in kind of extreme, might be too over the top of word, maybe an intense way. Do you have a similar trait in that regard? Is there a reason why you think you are this way, if you agree?
Yeah. I mean, opposites attract, but we didn't need to be attracted because we were born in the same family. So
Okay.
then they reflect the fact that we were in many ways opposites in terms of our pursuits, almost Christ Lucifer dyad, if you will. Then that also indicates that there's a complementarity, the yin and yang thing. That it's, there's one is the inversion of the other. So then there's always an overlap, as there is with the yin and yang. Which is in our biographies. So the opposite, for example, would be him pursuing worldly fame while and making a fortune out of the money he'd inherited, like increasing his wealth through investment, stock banking, and that kind of thing. While I disinherited everything and disappeared into darkest Africa, telling no one where I was going.
Sure.
Right, like Siddhartha in the story. Now that was clearly not a publicity stunt. And even my family didn't know what I was doing, never mind the world, but it was extreme. And that you can see how that's the opposite of what my brother was doing, but therefore in some ways complementary. Now, an example of what's much closer to similar would be, or the same would be, my exploration of Guatemalan whorehouses with a shaman in Guatemala, filming it as a means to try and free. We saw it as a shamanic exercise, a very long one. It took weeks or even months to expose areas of shame and darkness and denial, what have you, in my own psyche, to access my libido and so on, but also by immersing ourselves in the seamier sides of society. So that led to like serial soliciting of prostitutes at a period in my life with a spiritual framework, if you will, or a shamanic one at least. And my brother, on the other hand, part of his fame, or one of the things he presented with his fame, I think it was even a high point in terms of recognition, because I think for the BBC he did something about whoring. But anyway, he was known for having gone to 1,000 prostitutes, etc., etc. Now he turned that also into a kind of philosophy, or he made it part of a philosophy that was, I could say, not a million miles away from mine, but I could also say it was the absolute opposite. And it kind of illustrates my answer to your question.
One area I can actually personally relate to sort of both different approaches to whatever the quest is in this case is, when I was younger, I was someone who would very much have described myself as just a rational materialist. I thought there was nothing more to the world. In that sense, when you say that your brother was maybe seeking, it was the mundanity of the world that annoyed him. I had the similar sense. It was sort of like, is this all there is? Like, really? Like, this is almost like I am in a video game like The Sims. Like, is everyone else just cool with this? But at the same time, I'm very much related to your work in the sense that even though this is almost the paradox of the human, is like it's neither one nor the other. We've got both in us, because at the same time that I was saying and thinking, is there nothing else? There's nothing more. I was super interested in things like conspiracy stuff, like maybe there's more hidden knowledge somewhere or hidden lands we don't know about. Obviously, psychedelics was a big part of my life. Like, let's see if I can have experiences, if I can contact something external. Maybe there's some. So part of me must have sensed that there either is something more, or I've got a test for that. I'm yearning for something in that regard. And over the years, I've definitely shifted further towards the latter perspective. I wonder, in your own work, have you identified? I've seen some of the work you've done where you actually deconstructed, like the times when you were maybe a bit manic and thought you'd almost transcended or something. What do you think you were seeking? Do you know what the fundamental thing you were looking for in the world was when you started on these different quests and paths?
Well, I know what I thought it was back then, and I know what I think it was now, or at least what I came to decide later. Maybe right in the present moment, I might have to dig a bit deeper still, but certainly in those key years of my early 20s, really, I mean, there was a turning point which I mentioned when I disinherited my fortune. But it came before that, actually. Like I had this desire to make movies in Hollywood and stuff, and then I discovered Castaneda, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is a lot more interesting way to escape the dreary mundanity of the world than just becoming famous. Right? I'll become a sorcerer, and so that was very close to. I mean, those two things can be superimposed on one another, because the sorcerer's quest, as Castaneda defines it, is the quest for personal power, which my brother was like Nietzsche and would say everything is the will to power, was Nietzsche's
Right.
perspective. So I was questing for power back in those early days, but I was doing it in a way that I fooled myself that, because I did have a spiritual sense, well, before I discovered Castaneda, but in this turning point, I became more aware of what you said, was the yearning for something more than meets the eye, and with that yearning came a sense of the divine, and I'd say they're inseparable. Like the world is hiding from us.
Yes,
our experience of the divine, of God, and our own souls. That's the conspiracy in a nutshell. And so the very experience of seeing that the world is not enough is a true one. But why is it not enough? Because there's something more. And how do you reach something more? Well, this is where we get tricked. I call it the second matrix. You see you're in one matrix and you think, how do I get out? And then the controllers have already prepared matrix number 2 to lure you in. So I wouldn't have fooled myself that Hollywood was a spiritual pursuit, but there was something in there. But if I became famous and made movies, I could communicate spiritual truth thereby. Then when I discovered sorcery, that absolutely seemed like a spiritual path to me. Like I thought I was never going to go on the traditional Eastern spiritual path and look for a guru, but a sorcerer who could shapeshift and turn into a crow, absolutely, give me some of that. And so I set my sights on Mexico and learned Spanish and became a devout, if you will, self-made sorcerer. Like I never did find a Don Juan, although I did meet some teachers along the way, if you want to call them that. But anyway, to get to your question, I was consciously seeking power, but I didn't think of it as an ego way or a Nietzschean way. I just thought of it as I'm seeking for meaning, I'm seeking for the truth. Right? And personal power is part of that. Like you need personal power in order to face the truth, let's say, to handle the truth, which I think may even be true. So it wasn't consciously a quest for power. It's just that I was aware of that element through Castaneda. I was seeking the truth, and it felt absolutely divinely inspired. However, in my 40s, to jump far ahead, 15 years ahead or what have you, I became more and more aware over a very short period of time, really over a couple of years, that I had been deluded in some major ways. And one of the things that was congruent with that realization was that I'd been severely traumatized, the awareness of trauma and the effects of trauma. And I began to then join the dots that I was really, when I thought I was seeking for truth, well, I was seeking truth, but the truth I was seeking wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't that I'm really a sorcerer and that I can shapeshift and learn to fly. It was that something absolutely terrible happened in my past. I'm still carrying it around in my body, and until I resolve it, I'll never ever become whole. And so I was unconsciously seeking power as a way to escape that. Like if you've been rendered powerless through traumatic early experiences, you seek power. You are hardwired to seek power in order never to have to experience that again. And that's trauma genesis in a nutshell, as I've written about it. So that's the answer to your question. I thought it was one thing. I found out it was another.
Just on that topic, actually, I know obviously a topic you've mentioned it yourself is that you were very interested in cinema and wanted to be a script writer, etc. But if people don't know, that world is very much one of those ones where it's like you have to know people that know people, and there's so many factors that can disqualify you early on, or there's a million reasons as to why it's hard to break in that industry. Obviously, I don't want to sort of seem like I'm being frivolous here, but when you've talked about that topic, what you actually just described there, your own life quest, that actually sounds like it'd be a great movie. Like someone who goes out there, they seek out these experiences. You could obviously use all special effects. You could have him experiencing the different magical things, but then the actual conclusion later, it's a very human story. It's just about something that happened to you in your own biography, right?
Yeah, it would make a really, really bad movie, I think.
Okay.
With Cage, yeah, with the special effects, or a Marvel movie,
right?
Or something. Yeah, but which illustrates the point, right? That it's not, that world isn't really compatible with with what I was actually seeking to find, which was reality, and the dark aspects within Hollywood and within movies. They're always glamorized, and it's always framed in the quest for power. Right? It always is just about the quest for power, and then power brings happiness, essentially. Whereas it's not like that. It really can't be translated. I mean, I have had the same thought. Of course, I mean, later on in life, I did think, oh, maybe I can monetize my giving up my inheritance. I did get paid by the Guardian for it. It was the biggest paycheck I ever got for writing. I think 750 quid for writing a personal byline about me disinheriting my fortune.
Well, one thing that you were touching on earlier, I thought you phrased it very well there, actually, which is my own experience when I had this similar thing of thinking like, oh, there's nothing to life. It's all just, painted boards. It's like I'm in theatre here. There's no depth to life. I actually think my experiences through psychedelics and other things, which I didn't necessarily go super far down those paths. I sort of just took what I needed from them and came back or decided which one. I actually think I had a similar conclusion you were referring to there. It's the other way around. It's more like I had to sort of look through the world that already existed through different eyes. You could maybe say I deprogrammed myself to some of the social conditioning. And then suddenly, even the most everyday things seemed incredibly deep and referential to all sorts of art and literature and things throughout history. And as you said, I think you framed it very well. The real conspiracy is whatever like modern life TM is, whatever we pretend is the current state of affairs, which comes with all those corollary thoughts like, oh, it's progress and, the past was primitive, and ignore all those traditions. They're all nonsense. They didn't know X, Y, and Z, potentially fake facts about science that we now all have to believe is our new religion. And so essentially, like, it's almost like the conspiracy is how they trick you not to look at your life and not to question these things and not to examine what a human is, what the environment is, all these things. Like, I'm kind of with you on that. To me, the genius of the conspiracy is it is incredibly mundane. In fact, that is the role of it almost, right? Is to make things mundane. It's to make, that's the cleverest part. It's almost to deceive you that there is no depth. It's not to make it seem like it's something else or not allow you in. It's just, you wouldn't even look for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then that paves the way or sets the stage for the second Matrix again, that the forces, if you will, that flatten out the world that we perceive, they then prepare this three-dimensional, I'm trying to think of movie terms, but my mind's not coming up with them, but 3D, just 180 degrees sense around experience, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's spirituality or shamanism or Hollywood, right? There's a whole...
Oh, these are like the off-ramps, right?
Yeah. So then we think that we're transcending and aspiring, rather than staying put and just looking twice and three times. Wait a minute, is it really what it looks like that I need to escape from this? I mean, it's like the Chinese finger trap. I don't want to say the Matrix anymore because it's such a cliche,
Sure.
But yeah, of the mundanity of the world, that if it tricks you into trying to get out of it, or to transcend it, then you're really on your way to being lost. Whereas if you're willing to distrust the evidence of your senses and just explore a little bit further, I mean, it's actually where I'm at currently with The Landmade Man. I said this to somebody today, a carpenter today, about what he did will always be useful. You're doing a job that's actually always going to be useful. Yes. The old ways, even though they may not be spiritual, they're at least meaningful, right? They at least involve a relationship with matter and with nature.
Yes.
And because we've lost that, we've lost touch with our souls. And so the idea that we can somehow get back to a sense of meaning, bypassing nature and matter and physical reality, right? That's one way, another way of describing this trap, I think.
Since you are known to be an aficionado of cinema, and you've just referenced yourself, I mean, you obviously wrote an entire book about it, using the model of The Matrix, which is obviously a very good sort of modern, almost Gnostic take on the world, etc. Because people, I've noticed this is an interesting thing, mate, which is the way you can tell people are conditioned to dismiss certain things and accept other things, is there was that trend that started about 5-10 years ago, where if you just take literally any kind of world creation myth from a mythology or a religion that a normal person now would immediately dismiss, if you just change all the words to be computer programming terms and call it a simulation, they're not only like, oh, interesting, they just agree it's real and they think it's actually the case. So the funny thing is, The Matrix in that way is the ultimate metaphor. So my question is this. I remember on the old Stormy Weather podcast days, when you would often talk about this topic of the Matrix films and the fact that within the Matrix films, it's clever because they never overtly sort of said this. They maybe did some hints in the latter movies, but they actually did quite clearly, by some of the actions that in the normal plot don't necessarily make sense, imply that he was actually, Neo, after exiting the first Matrix, was in some kind of a second Matrix. And then, I mean, the point is, it was very much a Hollywood plot after that, right? There's a couple of questions I have about this. One is, the joke obviously would be, you could argue the filmmakers themselves were also creating a second Matrix in how they did the story, because a lot of people have that sense that the first movie is just a really brilliant standalone movie, and then the second one's almost undo or unravel a lot of it, which, if people know conspiracy world, the idea of like a limited hangout and this notion that like sequels maybe cut away what the originals power was or potency is a very common trend in Hollywood. That's why essentially people would say it's one of the reasons you do it, as well as to make money. And then the other thing would be, do you actually get the sense that like they were just hinting at that? Is there a reason that wasn't more explored? Because I have to say, even though I thought the second and third movie were very disappointing, when I actually saw those hints in the second movie, I remember thinking like, dude, I'll definitely watch this third one. Like, maybe it redeems it all. Maybe it's going to have some like amazing, super mindfuck ending where it turns out it was like a second, like, and they never did it. They just sort of like, it just went to sort of a more standard ending. So what would you say on this topic?
I think I had a similar thought that maybe that's why the second movie is so bad, and it's all intentional, right?
Right.
They're going to show that it's all. I think they just lost the plot. I mean, I think it's a very deep subject, and actually, I get into the Wachowskis in Big Mother, which is coming out because the middle part is about transgender, and so the fact that the makers of The Matrix are now, very high-profile public advocates for the glories of cutting your dicks off, let's put it bluntly, that says a whole lot about what the Matrix mythology was a delivery device for, right? The denial of the body, which is in Gnosticism as well, like the framing of physical matter as evil and as a trap. So I think that's where I'd have to go with it. That it doesn't really matter to me too much, like how much conscious intention there was and how much just mission creep in, a group of people making a really great movie in some ways that then actually, with hindsight, can be seen as a delivery device or a Trojan horse for something that is not only mediocre, crassly commercial, but also quite pernicious and malevolent. It happens anyway. The culture always does that anyway. So you don't have to assign any kind of conscious malevolent intentionality there. And I mean, it's been part of what I read and then wrote about the Wachowskis, particularly the first one, to jump the transgender shark, whoever it was, that his mind was on other things by the time he was doing. He was into a dominatrix in LA and getting needles stuck in his penis and all this stuff. Yeah, I mean, his mind definitely wasn't on making another masterpiece by that point. So he had, I guess you could say, put it pithily, he'd overdosed on his own red pill and then ended up creating the ultimate blue pill.
Yes, that's an interesting way to frame it. A question I have for you ties into what we were just talking about, is when it does come to the notion of a simulation, etc. The real problem with that is we're also, you notice immediately, just reaching for models like a movie or a video game. Like, I don't think anyone can really conceptualize this. Like, you can sort of think you can, but you can't really, because if you were in a simulation, then like, how could you know what it's like to not be in the simulation, as it were? So my question would be this: do you actually get the sense that it matters? Is essentially, like I said earlier, sometimes I also wonder if simulation theory is just a way of reinterpreting already what people's creation myths and God were anyway. Like, I don't really see what the difference is fundamentally in some sense, aside from certain technocrats that maybe want to use this as an excuse for us now to go into a simulation or some sort of technocratic nightmare. So does it matter if this is some sort of simulated reality? Is there any sense in which your own experiences have implied this?
Funny timing, because I was just saying to my wife last night in bed, I have always believed that none of this is real, that my waking reality is not real. And so nothing is going to change that. Nothing has changed that, and I don't suppose it will. She said, if you believe things you don't understand, you suffer, which is the Stevie Wonder thing. Okay, fair enough, but don't focus on the belief then. But I've always had this felt sense that things are not real. And it came up because it was extremely light at bedtime here at 10:30. And I'm like, I swear I've never lived in a country where it was bright daylight at 10:30. So something has changed in the whole planetary system since last year. But obviously there's not on the news, and there's not a whole panic across the world. So I'm not going to get any confirmation of this, but I swear that's what's happened. And that was the context. And because there's many experiences that many people can have where they say, wait a minute, that couldn't really have happened without it being paranormal, just that things didn't add up in some way.
Okay.
Right. Sorry,
no, it's okay.
For a second. So, where was I going to go with that? I did lose the thread.
About the idea that you've always had a sense that life wasn't really real, or that something about it was off, and the notion of like maybe we are in a simulation or a second matrix, or maybe it doesn't matter if we are.
Yeah, well, I think we're kind of back, for me anyway, we're back to that original question of the mundanity of the world and it being an illusion. That's the irony, right? Because it's not necessarily the world itself that's unreal, but our framing of it. But somehow our framing is so profound. And of course, if we start to glimpse that our framing is unreal, our own sense of reality comes under. And we can't say that reality isn't there, because that's an oxymoron, that contradicts itself. But we can certainly say that our interpretation of reality is wrong. And we can, if we want to take that further and say it's so wrong that essentially we're clueless about the nature of reality, and that it literally could be that the sun didn't set one night and nobody said anything, right? It's just you that noticed it, because it's just you and God, really. You're just in this simulation, if you will, but it's created by God for your soul. And I prefer theological terms. And that's it. You're just consciousness interacting with the infinite and the eternal. And I absolutely believe that. I mean, I can state that sounds real and true to me, although it's not an article of belief in the sense that I build a philosophy around it. I tried with Matrix Warrior. But the thing I wanted to end on, or get to at least, was that the people who talk about simulations being real, in my experience, they never, ever take the next step, which is completely unavoidable, and yet somehow they manage to avoid it. That if this is a simulation, therefore it's all unreal, what are they? How do they somehow expostulate from that, or maintain within that the idea that they're real? Right?
Oh, by the way, I'd actually just say, if you notice, whenever people talk like that, this is why I know no one can really conceptualize it, mate, because they just think of the movie The Matrix. Like, they'll say things like, how do we get out of this simulation? And I'm like, bro, wait, if the simulation, like, aren't you just like a computer program in the simulation? Like, how would you exit? You know what I mean? Like, I agree with you. They never ask that fundamental question, right? They actually do think of it as though maybe they're the only real human and they can exit like a Black Mirror episode or something. Yeah. You're right. That is almost like a paradox built into their way of thinking.
Yeah, so it's not, question isn't only where would they be outside the simulation and what's it like, but where are they now? Where do they
Right.
think they are now while they're having this experience of simulation? And of course, as you said, they're completely clueless. That all they can then go is to the Matrix or some other movie scenario and say, well, I must be in a pod somewhere.
Yes.
That's why the computer idea is appealing, because it does it's basically saying the real world is the same as the simulated world. It's just that it's real, right? So,
Yes.
and I guess they would hope there would be more fun or more sex in the real world, but because the Matrix turned that on its head and the real world is less appealing than the fake world, which I think was a good idea. I mean, that was one of the good things in there. But no, it doesn't add up. We have to be complete. Not only does reality have to be completely unfamiliar to us if all we know is a simulation, but what we are in that reality would also have to be utterly unknown to us.
Yes. Yes. I notice also, by the way, they also tend to bundle into it the notion that if this is how you know they're actually connecting to religious impulses in people, because there's also, I notice a lot of the framing is the notion that even if it's a simulation, it's actually like they always conflate the notion that it's almost directly simulating whatever, as you say, the real world would be. And it's just like, oh, but this is just a slightly fake one. They can never even conceptualize notions that even the Matrix projects, which is like, what if the real world is nothing like this one? What if the real world even has different laws of physics and things like that? Like they never, it's funny, this is supposed to be an out there theory, but it seems like a lot of the thinking is done by very mundane minds on this topic.
Yeah, well, that's transhumanism in a nutshell.
Sure. By the way, along these lines, another thing I remember you talking about on the Stormy Weather days, which in some ways I will say almost with like a perverse pornographic enjoyment. One of the things I did enjoy about that period is that was when in some ways you were like very full on into a certain way of thinking. And so as a result, a lot of the ideas that were percolating were, again, quite intense. And one of them I remember you bringing up then was obviously like a kind of a Gnostic idea of what if all consciousness or intelligence is essentially the monad. It's just like one entity. I mean, I notice again, this shows me how much of the world is conditioning and sort of limited hangout type behavior, even through religious schools. Because if I reframed the idea that like, oh, it's all one consciousness, but I say it, like in some Buddhist way of like, it's like we're just a drop that goes back to the ocean. That sounds really sort of safe. That sounds like, oh, that's okay. Whereas the weird thing I notice whenever people talk about the idea of one consciousness or God is like, we're like a fragment of God interacting with him and having a different experience, they never do seem to put in the sort of Gnostic element of like, that could be quite sinister though, right? Like maybe a level of reality is torment in a way that you have to experience these certain things and be disconnected to have some sort of almost a joyride of what it's like to be a human or something. What would you say to this topic? It sounds like that the thinking of kind of monad thinking is quite central to your philosophy, right?
Well, it was, as you said, back then. I noticed that because I revisited my sources revelation, which was basically the idea that consciousness, yes, got fragmented, and then the fragments got fragmented, and that to add confusion further into the mix, which although this is kind of fragmentation too, that through certain interfering forces, I don't know if I included them in my sources revelation back then, the fragments of consciousness that were real began to dream other fragments, like create tulpas of disowned parts of their consciousness, and that the world is mostly filled with these tulpas being dreamed by the fragments of the monad, and that the plot is to prevent the true fragments, soul fragments, from finding one another and reuniting, because they're constantly interacting with these tulpas, which are just fragments of their own unconscious, and therefore seen as extremely annoying and oppressive and all the rest of it. But also just because they're everywhere, you can't, how the hell do you find your own kind when you're just swimming through a sea of Walmart people? That was that was summing up the sources revelation. And the consciousness is finite. The human consciousness is finite. Was central to that. And then anyway, I revisited it recently. But since that time, by the time I revisited it, the notion of APCs or NPCs, non-player characters, is now doing the rounds.
Yes.
It's now gone memetic. And so it's time for me to disown it, really, I suppose, because probably a lot of non-player characters running around talking about non-player characters.
Sure.
Right? As you say, they don't believe that they're that. but they want to point at anyone they don't like and say maybe they are. But what was your question? So it was more general, wasn't it? Like,
it was well, essentially, do you still align with, like, when you said earlier about the idea of like the interaction with God directly, etc.? Like, do you still have some kind of a thinking like the idea that there's a monad or everything comes from one source in some way?
Well, I was thinking about this. I mean, I've been experiencing this recently, and I also just said it in our exchange when I said that this is the soul interacting with God. That's all that's happening and all ever can happen, and everything else is a distraction. Or if you settle down, calm down, and just allow it, it just is that. Like whatever's happening that might distract you, if you don't let it distract you from that sense that all of this is existence interacting with your consciousness, then it's no longer a distraction. But if you're actually believing that you're interacting with human beings who have thoughts and feelings about you, and most essentially of all, or most cripplingly of all, those thoughts and feelings have any bearing on your sense of who you are, then you're pulled into the illusion. Because only in this model, I don't want necessarily to come across as a deeply religious person, although I don't mind, but it is, I'm just using language as best as I'm able. Only God can judge your soul, which is really to say only you, but through your sense of the divine, can have a sense thereby of whether you're in God's favor or not, for God's sake. But actually, only God decides. But anyway, so that's that is that model. I've just stripped away all the sci-fi and all the sorcery. It doesn't necessarily mean that nobody else is real. It's just that from your point of view, you can never know. You can never corroborate anyone else's consciousness. You can never know what the quality of experience is. You can never know if they are being truly what they are, or if they're playing a role, or like. So everybody could be demonically possessed entities there to tempt you and trap you from connecting to God, like Jesus in the desert. But also everybody could be angels in disguise who's trying to help you, and it could even be the same thing, or both at the same time, and so on. So that's just as credible a theory or a statement as that we could be in a simulation. It's kind of similar, but you've always got the one thing you always have is your consciousness, which has the word conscience in it. And so that's the point of reference. Surely that's the only point of reference we have, plus existence. Obviously, I'm not advocating solipsism. Then there's the whole of existence, which, whatever your point of view, it's very big. I mean, you could say that NASA lied about everything, and there's only this planet and a few whatever, but it's still extremely big.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
Just allow nature. It's such a huge system. And if you allow all the other apparent human beings and so on, we're in this vast system of intelligence, interacting with it, trying to find our way to a state of grace. That's it.
One thing you're talking about here that I definitely want to ask about, sort of the implications on the mind and your personality if you go undergo such a change, is when you're describing there the notion that like each individual person, essentially each person's journey of life might just be for them. Maybe the people that come across them are like, they're people who, as you say, can help, or they can hurt, or they can guide you, or they can mislead you. And essentially some of it's free will, some of it's like an experience, maybe a quest for God or whatever. I would say if people know within the occult, particularly like the Aliester Crowley type school of ceremonial magic, they have one of those at one of the higher up orders. There's a very famous vow that you take where basically it's like this. You vow that you will interpret every single experience as essentially a direct communication from God. And the thing I want to ask about with this is, on the one hand, that actually is, as grandiose as it might sound, something akin to one of the conclusions I sort of have drawn about my own life. Again, like you, I don't necessarily go totally solipsistic. I sometimes think maybe this is just the messages sent to me, or the way that my eye sees the world and certain symbols. But essentially, I do see synchronicities everywhere, and I do have like ridiculous coincidences seemingly happening out of nowhere, and people coming in. And it's more like if I just follow the thread, I get where I need to go. But at the same time, when I look at people who did like the literal magical techniques that we're talking about like this, a lot of them, this is the tricky part, right? Externally, they do appear to have descended into madness or lost the plot or ended up dying in ridiculous circumstances. Now, I will say, as an external person, if you don't understand that premise, it already would look like madness. You will already think, this person, they need to be committed, or whatever the way a normie would say it. Would you actually say, do you think your experiences coincide with the notion that, is there a way to see the world in this perspective without sort of going mad, if being mad is a real thing in that sense?
Well, yeah, okay, with that proviso.
Yes.
Going mad in the way that you mean it, and I would mean it like Crowley went mad and Castaneda went
exactly.
mad. Became highly toxic and destructive to themselves and to others.
Like, put it this way, if those are the inputs, the outputs of their life don't seem like something you'd want, right?
Absolutely no. I mean,
yes.
the first point is that if it's an article of belief and you don't understand it, you will not only suffer, you will make other people suffer. So the action and the experience has to come first, and the understanding later, without any intervening belief. I would say. I mean, I've just said that now, but it's quite pithy. It's like a fortune cookie wisdom or something, or hopefully a real wisdom. But maybe I'll say it again. If you have the experience, you're in it, and you don't have to talk about it. But we are talking about it, and as far as I know, I am talking from experience and not from belief. My understanding is limited, but if, insofar as my understanding allows me to articulate it, it doesn't require belief. I can just keep going back to the experience and keep testing it and keep checking it. And if you ask me like now, do I believe it? You didn't exactly ask me that, but as part of the question, do I believe this? Well, no, I don't have to. I mean, I don't disbelieve it. Believe it. Do I fully understand it? No, I understood it as well as I'm able to practice it, and the more I practice it, the more I can understand it, and then maybe talk about it. But if there's a necessity or a reliance on beliefs which have created belief systems, BS for sure, as in the case of Crowley and Castaneda, that way madness lies, I'd say. And I mean, there is more to be said there, I think, and I think it's a very good area to explore into. There is more to be said, like what goes wrong with these characters.
Yes.
And I think it has to do, well, maybe I'll end up saying the same thing differently, but it's kind of what we talked about at the beginning. Are these individuals, by believing something like every interaction with the world is between my soul and God kind of thing, are they really seeking for power and to escape some feeling of powerlessness, or not? Or are they, because why do you have to make a vow about it, right? True. Why isn't it just the side effect or the gradual understanding, realization, surrender even of just giving up all of your dreams and your illusions and your delusions and just getting on with the mundane existence of trying to live in the world without any bitterness? So we've come back to what we touched on initially, like these magical systems and beliefs and philosophies are a means to try and transcend the world.
Yes.
But, I mean, it's even in the gospel, I think. I'm not sure where this quote comes from, be in the world but not of the world. And I've extended that through my experience, that the more deeply in the world I can be, the more I can experience myself as not of the world. And complementarily, the more I can experience that I am not of this world, the more deeply I can go into this world. And those are complementary. And that you could say that's a philosophy in itself too, but it's a discovery. I'd say it's a discovery. And I could turn it into a system and say, do this and do that. And to some extent I have, but it would involve things like learning carpentry or running a thrift store. It doesn't involve ceremony or magic, just the absolute, I'm not the absolute opposite, but in essence, I'd say it's the opposite.
One thing I will ask about some specific figures, like some direct things about them and your experiences. But to pick up the thread of what we're talking about here, one thing that seems quite unusual to me about all these different traditions, especially the more like sort of cool modern ones like Castaneda or Crowley and Thelema and stuff, is I can't, part of me used to just simplistically dismiss it as like, oh, you know, there's like two types of people in the world. There's leaders and there's followers. Because one of my own experiences in life was I was always someone who was always on the fringes. I was always an outsider. I was always trying to find my own perspective, or essentially I've always summarized my philosophy as this: if it doesn't make sense to me, then I don't worry about it. Essentially, I just think, right, it's just not for me. Like that, I don't have to accept it because something about it doesn't jive with me. But I notice a lot of people aren't like that. So I always just got the sense eventually like, oh, maybe some people just need everything spoon fed to them, or they don't want to think for themselves. But I actually don't know if that's it, because when I look at a lot of these traditions, to me, one of the flaws is it's not that the original person has to always be a liar and a fraud and there was no sort of spiritual truth, or there was nothing there. There was no like actual meat on the bones, as it were. To me, it's more like their own experience was to be an outsider and to be an iconoclast and to be someone with revolutionary thoughts. Like, I'll give you the best examples. I know you've actually contacted this person. If people know the figure Kenneth Grant, who made his own school of the OTO, and obviously there's the whole dispute over whether he was the proper successor to Crowley or not. The reason the mainstream OTO people dismiss him, essentially, is the notion he's too radical and he had his own things that what Crowley said. But it's like, I always think like, bro, if you were actually a fan of the man Aliester Crowley and you thought what he did was brilliant, surely you see that that's what he did to the traditions before him. Like, his whole thing was he would enter a particular school, get as many of the ranks as he could, trying to essentially get the secret sauce, and then bounce and do his own thing, rebrand it and make his own version of it. And yet these people, they're nothing like him. They're actually the follower. They're the person who wants, essentially, if Crowley wasn't around, they would just be like a Catholic or something like that, or a Buddhist, or they'd just be in some tradition because they want someone to tell them what it is. So to me, part of it seems almost like it is almost like the commodification of these things. It's like, if you don't, like if someone was someone I thought had spiritual wisdom, all I would want them to tell me is this: aside from for fun and for pleasure to read their experience, I would just want to know, what did you do? And then I want to go away and do it myself. I don't want you then to just sit and then you to tell me how to interpret it and what it means. It's like, that's for me, that's my journey, surely. So what would you say on this topic? Because I feel like when people look into these figures, it's too easy to either just buy in and you ignore all the flaws, or you see the flaws and then you assume it's all fraudulent. So where do you come down on this sort of this aspect?
Well, the first thing that struck me was what you said about the followers and leaders, because that's something my brother would say. And even in that context, if he would dismiss somebody like Crowley, also rock stars, because he wanted to be a rock star. But to him, it was a kind of paradox, because a rock star stands there on the stage and he looks at his audience and he knows that everybody in that audience, this is my brother's view, wants to be on the stage instead of him, wants to be him.
Right.
So he can't not have a certain degree of contempt for that audience because of that gulf between them. And this goes double for a guru, because the context really there is, I know something you don't and you need me to figure it out.
Yes.
Right. So that's number one. But the problem there with my brother's point of view was that he threw out the baby with the bathwater, essentially, because if you extend that to basically, I don't have to listen to anybody, nobody can tell me anything, which is very tempting for the self-warranting or the self-defining identity.
Sure.
To think that because I was like, this is a shaman, in quotes, like I was part of a system in Guatemala, but I kept thinking and acting as if the rules didn't apply for me, because I didn't want to obey any kind of rules. But that's a total contradiction, because why try and join or practice any kind of system of knowledge if you're then going to say, well, I don't like that and I don't like that and I can do it my own way? Well, the answer would be to be a revolutionary or reformer, as you put it. You can take the good parts and add your own, but then why would you do that? And to me, they're both traps. Like, being a follower is a trap, is probably pretty obvious, doesn't need exploring too much. But being a leader is also a trap. First of all, if you have followers, because then you can get trapped by your followers, essentially, like not being able to go electric. But even if you do the Kenneth Grant or the Jung thing and you say, well, Freud was good for so long, but now I see that he's not so good, I can do better. And so you create apostasy or whatever. You recruit whoever you can from the old group and start the new discipline or the new religion, then you just become like the guy that you've rejected. You might not have rejected him on ethical grounds, but still, you're still then basically setting yourself up as a leader now, and then you're going to have followers and they'll do it to you. Actually, this is actually happening to me currently as we speak.
Okay.
Very timely. So it's all traps. It's all traps. Like the line in the council, it's all shit. You know, all these worldly ways of trying to define ourselves or find our purpose and meaning, they're all shit because of what we talked about. Like the existence isn't what we think it is. It's not a bunch of individuals competing for power and status, which basically is what's out there if you look closely enough in every single interaction.
Yes.
Right, even the one we're having now, which seems perfectly warm and friendly, and is, I think, it's going to be in there somewhere.
Oh, for sure.
If you listen closely enough, find that thing, right? So
it's why people often say that when you get lenses like the sexual marketplace dynamics, or you understand concepts like, who has power in a relationship, like that lens can warp how you see it all, because obviously those aspects come to the fore completely, right?
Yeah, right. So and they do when things crystallize. That's why, you know, a good solid group becomes a cult if it gets too big or goes on too long or things get overlooked, right? So, but there is something going on, and everything's a cult anyway because of what we've been talking about. You can't really avoid being in a cult. I mean, even two people can sort of create a cult if we keep agreeing enough. But within that, there are these two individual points of consciousness within existence, as we talked about. And so in what you've talked about, there's a leader who's trying to find his own way by being a leader. And if he falls into the trap of identifying being a leader, he'll never find his way back to his soul either. But he still might do it. And he could even create a nasty cult on the way, like Castaneda. Well, I think that they're inseparable, actually. I think if that individual found his way or her way to the soul, then they would certainly come back and undo the damage they'd done and make sure that they would have to, essentially. So I'd say those two things go together, and you don't see that very often. And if some leader takes care not to create that, you know, basically delude a bunch of people into believing things that aren't true without knowing them and so on, and gets power. If they manage not to do that, we probably haven't heard of them. I mean, Steiner's something of an exception because I think Steiner did more or less avoid this trap based on what I can see. And he was fairly large, and obviously he's well known now, but he doesn't really have a whole, I mean, the anthroposophy doesn't seem to have anything to do with Steiner as far as I see it. So anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked, but the example, I'll just extend what I said to finish also to the follower, like the follower and including the reformer like Grant. Well, I don't like these examples because I think Crowley was really involved in just stuff that we wouldn't even want to talk about if we brought that up, or we talk about it in a different context. But anyway, that person, the ordinary follower or the follower who creates his own thing, they're also trying to sort the seeds of their own delusion and find what's real. And they also can do so by that path of following or reforming. But again, like, do they? Because for me, on my journey, as you know, there's been a lot of renunciation.
Of course, yes.
Specifically the things I've said. I'm like, don't listen to that. Don't read those books. Or if you do, here's what I think about them now. Like a constant, not redacting, because it's actually, that's my body of work, as you can see. Right. And we're going to get into this really is the overview. You can see all the croppers that I've come, all the mistakes I've made. And that's actually central to what I can offer. But it wouldn't be much good if it didn't also then have the reevaluation and what I then found. You know, each time finding something closer to reality. You know, further, the map gets better and better and more representative of the reality until eventually, potentially, there's no map at all. I'm just communicating my experience of reality. I imagine I wouldn't be doing a podcast by that time, but who knows? And maybe I'll become. I mean, I've veered on the edges of cult leader myself, and had to renounce it. So So it isn't either or, to wind up and affirm what you were asking. Really, it can't be either or. We're in the world, but we don't have to be of the world, and we have that ability to recognize when we're becoming of the world, when we're getting lured by whatever it is. But going off to a cave, or to bring it back to your analogy, just saying, well, I'm not a follower, which is a different way of going off to a cave,
Yes.
I think. That's no solution, because then you haven't confronted your own weaknesses and foibles, like you or whoever, like my brother, who says they're not a follower. It's bullshit. They are following, right?
Of course.
Everybody's following something.
Yes. Let's talk about some of these specific figures in your life that were influential, your quest. So obviously Castaneda is a great starting point, right? One thing I would ask, and this is one of those things where I sort of have a little bit of experience of what it was like before the internet was as pervasive. Like, for example, I read the first Castaneda book, I think in the early 2000s, when it was just back in the day when Amazon had those, like, the list feature where people would make lists of, like, other books that they'd enjoyed. And I think at the time I was just going through a mixture of sci-fi / occult stuff. And it was one of the books there. And I remember reading the premise and going, this sounds amazing. Like, I didn't actually even know initially that it was supposed to necessarily be totally factual. I even wondered it's funny, I didn't know at the time people knew it was a fraud. I actually wondered when I first read it, like, is this almost some sort of like Swiftian parody of what like a sort of Mesoamerican mystery school would be like? But as far as I know, it initially was presented not just as something real. If people don't know, you actually did a podcast, I forget with who, but it was the woman who was involved in one of the groups, where you were clearly very well versed on all the fraudulent aspects of Castaneda. And I know that apparently it was even presented initially, it was part of like his like degree course or something wild like that, and he became like a teacher as a result of it. So obviously it wasn't just presented as some like flight of fancy or like, you know, here's my version of a thing like that. So it was initially presented as real. And I will say, I do think actually when you read the first few books, it is super important. You are just like, wow, is this like a thing that goes on in the world? Is this a different way of seeing the world? Like, I can see why it has that attraction to people. But then what I want to ask was, I know obviously it must have taken like a few decades before people like started to clue in on some of the things that were fraudulent, or people that maybe didn't exist, or just things about it that were obviously nonsense. And he himself did definitely go down the cult route like you're talking about, and that seemed to eventually dominate his life or thinking. So my question would be, when you were initially discovering this material, had you ever read that some of it was fraudulent? Did you even have any hints of that? And then also, I think tied in with this, because if you notice, this is a theme I'm asking about a lot of these figures about, and I will continue to, is I do think in all these areas, there is a sort of like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater aspect of thinking. Like, to me, it does betray a sort of raw rational materialism to just think, if I can find a flaw or something that's untrue about this, then everything's untrue about it. Like, what's your sense in that regard? Because it seems like you did heavily go into this, but it's definitely one of the ones you've very much repudiated since, right?
Yeah, almost to my regret. I almost feel I might have over-repudiated.
Right.
I quoted Castaneda just yesterday in an email. I mean, I found it online, a passage that struck me recently as just really meaningful and really helpful.
There's something there, right?
Yeah, and part of my experience of finding that quote, or remembering it rather, I didn't have to find it online except for other people, was, gosh, I still have that. I still have something of great value from Castaneda that I carry with me. And so then I started thinking about it, and thinking, wait, it's not the books themselves that are bad. It's what grew around them and what they led to. So which we were touching on earlier. And so it's not that what Castaneda did itself was fraudulent, or, I mean, there certainly was some deception in there, but
yes,
say that there was a strategy in there that itself wasn't, I don't think it was 100% or even 50% malign. He was really attempting something profound, and it's in the books. The material is profound. And so the question then is, what the effect of the books is, and what the effect, and overall, I think that's been negative. So where does that leave me? And on me, I think they were negative. But I know what I thought of yesterday. It's homeopathy. It's like a homeopathic thing. If you overdose on it, it's going to kill you.
Right.
But that very quality that makes it deadly also makes it medicinal. That's my feeling about Castaneda. He himself dosed on something, and then he felt that it's red pill again, overdose. He wanted to dose the whole world. I mean, it was that whole culture back then with psychedelics. So that's really key. And that's in us, like this hunger or this greed even for power, knowledge that becomes power. When that possesses us, we will turn a blessing into a curse. And that Castaneda did that. And I think most people who followed him did it. And I think that somehow it was known ahead of time. And I think even that those books were going to be debunked as false. You know, I could even really go on a limb and say Castaneda deliberately falsified stuff, or some part of him, or something in him, or just God, if you prefer, did that so that eventually they would be debunked, and so it would neutralize the damage it could do, right? And yet there's still there's terrifying truths in there, and there's beautiful, wonderful truths in there, and well, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, which doesn't necessarily mean read the books, but suspend judgment on it. This whole thing of true or false, although that's a slippery slope if we're doing parapolitical analysis and people try and dodge responsibility with some kind of what we believe quantum thinking, you know, that's got to ring an alarm bell. But you're talking about the world of sorcery, that really is that world that we were touching on earlier with me with the daylight at 10:30, like where reality isn't fixed in the way that we think it is. So how would you represent that world as factual? Like that in itself is a paradox. So I think, so to answer your first question, I had no clue that there was fraudulence in Castaneda's reporting. However, when I learned about it, wasn't that long after I read them. It might have even been quite soon after, and I didn't care. Not because I thought it doesn't matter if they're true or not, but because I thought I knew they were true. And I thought anyone who was trying to debunk them just had a bug up their ass. And you know, we're clutching at straws. So I didn't read any of those books until later. I've recently reread them, partly because I wanted to dispel my delusions again, because I was starting to think, wait a minute, that Castaneda stuff seems like it was real after all. I can't remember why now. And I feel it's important for me not to invest in that dream of sorcery and all that stuff. I would say not even if it's real, but especially if it's real. It's a bad idea to believe in it and pursue it, because we're not ready for the truth. We can't handle that kind of truth. Castaneda couldn't handle it. Maybe there are beings like Don Juan, but if so, what the hell would you do when you met one? It's like meeting an angel. You know, you either shit your pants or you fall down on your knees. Right? Neither is a good outcome. So it's not really. It has to be fiction, essentially, one way or another. If it's presented to the rational mind, that can only really come out as fiction. And well, it's great fiction. It's great fiction, but I suppose back to the simulation thing. If you're going to try and make it literal, think it through, right? Think it all the way through, because you might not want to actually end up sitting there thinking, I don't exist. And I mean, you can think that, but are you ready to have an experience of non-existence, right? Who the hell is? Yeah. So yeah, I feel it keeps coming up, this theme of what is it in us that's seeking for this thing, and what would it do if it got it? Like if we're really seeking an experience of God or whatever because we want to be powerful, what a joke that is.
Yes.
You meet God, you are not going to feel powerful.
Yes. I mean, along these lines, one thing that you immediately make me think of there is, I always feel like one of the sort of analytical lenses or models that a lot of Western people are missing. It's because essentially, if you look at like a lot of the Western religious traditions, are by definition just binary. It's all just duality. It's like there's good, evil. It's all opposites basically. But they never do that thing where they do the yin yang, where you have a bit of one and the other. So in a lot of other traditions, if people aren't aware, the concept of like a trickster figure is is quite key. And again, people will always get lost in it. Like, so wait a minute, is it someone like evil deceiving you, or is it like a good? It's like the idea is it's something between. And when you bring this up about Don Juan, the reason and Castaneda, the reason why I think of that immediately is that kind of trickster thinking is actually a massive part of those actual traditions in that part of the world as well. And so I would actually even add in, when you were thinking there of the idea that maybe some of this almost was like, it's almost like a barrier wall to a fire, that the fire can only spread so far, but we've got to contain it eventually. If you notice, that does seem to be woven into a lot of like parapsychology, parapolitical stuff. This idea that like you say, you put in something potentially intentionally false so that later on when the person, you know, in the movie trope runs to their friends like, look at this, look what they have. They go, no, look, that was fake. He never was there on that date. And, you know, this didn't happen. The sun didn't set on, you know, this particular month. And so the classic movie trope is, you know, you take the person back to the office where all these aliens were and stuff, but then they open the door and there was never anyone there. There was never an office. That almost seems to be built into this. I remember there was a Terence McKenna story he told about when he took a lot of mushrooms in the Amazon and he had an actual like UFO experience. But the joke he even says himself is when the UFO came really close overhead, he looked and he noticed it essentially was like all the really obvious fake ones of like a saucepan lid from like back in the day when of his youth. And so it's almost like the experience that he was having had contained within it elements to invalidate it if he attempted to impart the experience to someone else who hadn't had the experience. Like, do you think this is actually a thing? I mean, people could obviously tie it into a religious thinking and think, you know, this is either like it's God winking at you, or it's someone sort of saying, you know, keep this under your hat. Like, if you tell anyone else, they won't believe you. I mean, there's something to that, right?
Yeah, but there's other things. I mean, there's different ways to look at this, what you raised. I mean, I can think of at least two. One is the satanic counterfeit. I stuttered in the night, so it caused me to hiss on the word satanic. Satanic counterfeit. And we could posit that maybe that Satan can't do that good a counterfeit of a god or a UFO or whatever, and we could see through it. I think that might be naive because I think Satan's really good at faking stuff.
Seems awesome, yeah.
Yeah, but so we could bookmark that because I think that's a large subject in terms of also when you're talking about synchronicities, like all worldly phenomena. I guess I'm not bookmarking it now. All worldly phenomena. An epiphenomena is temporal. Therefore, you could say it's illusory if you want to get Eastern spiritual about it. But even if you want to get logical about it, like if God exists in eternity and the soul exists in eternity, anything temporal can't exist there. It can't. It can't even have an instant's existence because the longest period of time is nothing in eternity, right? So anyway, I've kind of stopped my own thoughts with that one. But yeah, all temporal phenomenon, in some sense, or in very real sense, is illusory. So if we're fixating on that, whether or not it's a UFO, but anything, it's a trap, it's a trick. I mean, you have to end up there. The netty, not this, not that. None of this is God. If all of this is God, then none of it's God, right, by definition.
I mean, I guess what I'm sort of getting at is like, it's not something I necessarily subscribe to, but like I say, it is part of like many religious traditions. It's almost the notion that like the trickster figure is imparting some knowledge to you, but he's also sort of being like, you've got to figure it out. And also like, stop looking at the finger, look at the moon, as it were. Like, stop focusing on me. Part that is fake. Like, obviously, inherently, I aren't a purely spiritual being. I am a man saying something to you, you know?
Yeah, and what's the finger pointing to, or what's the moon?
Yes.
Well, this is a good analogy. The moon is just reflecting the sun. So if you follow the finger to the moon, then you've got to follow the moon to the sun. And so in the analogy here, I'd say that don't look at the finger, don't look at the moon, but look at yourself. Look at the one who's looking at the moon, because that's where the sun is, if you will. That's where your consciousness of the moon is what is real. The moon you can never know is real, but your perception of the moon, you can say, you know, that's real, right? There's nothing else if you're looking only at the moon. So the trickster thing relates to that, I think, and the UFO. I don't want to simplify it by saying it's a mirror, because that you could just put full stop and say, but there's so many ways to interpret that. But that it's co-creating your consciousness of it, and you are co-creating it through your consciousness, that interface. So that's, I mean, that is kind of trickster territory in and of itself. And the trickster, can shrug and look at you and go, well, don't blame me. No, I'm just the figment of your imagination, Charlie. But where does that leave you? At a certain point, back to the simulation, it leaves you in a spot. Well, if I'm hallucinating all of this, who am I? Who am I without any of this to define me? If all of this is a hallucination, then I am too. So that's that. I feel that there's something, because we're talking about a number of individuals that I feel are really untrustworthy: Crowley, Castaneda, McKenna. And so if we just say that they're trickster figures, and well, they're just reflecting our own folly back at us, we're giving them a kind of free pass. And I think that part of the neti, it's not just saying, not this, this isn't God, this isn't God, this isn't it. It's also, because this isn't an Eastern thing, it's also dualistic. Is this God? Is this coming from God, or is it coming from Satan? Is this coming from my soul, or is this coming from something that is not my soul?
Yes.
Like there is something else. Otherwise, we'd already be there, right? By definition, there has to be something that's interfering and preventing us from having an experience of goodness, 100%, 24/7. Unless you're going to say that's boring and you don't want that, but
Sure.
I'm not in that place. So I feel the thing I feel that's missing, and I don't mean we have to go into it, but is that if you start looking at Castaneda, as I did in Prisoner of Infinity, or McKenna, or Crowley, as I did in Vice of Kings, what you find in these narratives, these beliefs, these groups, these institutions, these practices, these methodologies, is, to just keep it really short, a philosophy that rationalizes and justifies brutality and sadism that's directed towards other human bodies, including bodies of children. Like that is, you cannot dig deeply into any of these schools of thought and systems. I'm not saying any at all, actually, because I'm thinking of Steiner again. I'm sure there are some that somehow manage to stay clean, but the ones we're talking about anyway, that have become culturally, across the world, when you follow the threads, what helped make them successful and what was underlying them, and even was practiced by the leaders involved, like Castaneda or Crowley, then you find evidence of this kind of deeply pathological behavior. So that's, you've got to then throw that in. The trickster,
yes,
so it is beyond good and evil in the sense that it doesn't care. Like there's an element that will use evil also to teach lessons.
Yes,
it's fine if you say, okay, that's existence, I accept evil, but I don't think it's so fine if you say that about individuals. Like if we know, like nobody wants to have a picture of Jimmy Savile on their wall unless they believe it was all conspiracy theory, just because he gave money to some charity.
Exactly.
Now, right, that you find out certain things and you say, okay, this is toxic. That's my thing with Castaneda. It's not about what's in the books and any lies. It's about what he became and what he was part of, what promoted Castaneda and sorcery was malevolent and destructive. Therefore, it's tainted.
Yes,
it can be seen that it was an instrument of something diabolical. Now, again, I'm going to repeat myself. You can say, well, okay, but behind that is Satan, and behind Satan's God, so it's all part of existence, so don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But then we've gone up a level. You see what I mean?
Yes.
Right? One's more abstract, but if we're just talking in the frame of reference where who are you going to choose to babysit your kids kind of frame.
Yes. Well, I mean, one thing I would say is, like, I think you're making a very shrewd point here, which is it is too easy to also go, well, it's a trickster figure, and then therefore somehow that makes everything they did fine, or it's not a big deal. Because as you say, like, it's almost the mystical equivalent of people on the internet. Like, I was just trolling. Like, it's like, yeah, but the real question is, what would motivate you to annoy someone, or to waste their time, or to say things that are untrue? Like, there is something more sinister there, right? Again, obviously, without going into some of the extremely dark elements you alluded to there. Another thing I would say, which I did want to ask you about, because it's a more broad point about life or the experience of life, is within these circles, I can see from their actions, and some of them, this is actually codified in the way that they think, is another thing about being the guru or the leader, which means that they do often tend to quite horribly mistreat the people who are their followers, as opposed to, lead them to enlightenment or whatever. It seems to be, it's like what you said about your brother's take on the rock star versus the audience. It seems like they naturally have a contempt to their followers, where it is sort of like, look, if you're stupid enough to follow me and believe everything I say and give me all your money and give me every orifice in your body, then fuck it, yeah. Like, I'm the sort of person who, for whatever reason, is going to do that. I'm not talking directly about myself. I'm trying to put myself in their framework of mind. And I would say this ties to what appears to be, I almost dare not say a spiritual truth, but if this world was a simulation, mate, then to me, one of the rules of it that I've heard many people articulate in many other ways, but it does have there's something about it vibes with me, is the notion that something about the realm we live in does appear to be about personal responsibility. And so I don't subscribe to this, but other people who are maybe more malevolent figures interpret that as, if I sort of show you that this is a bit fucked up, or show you there's something a bit off about this, and then I ask you, do you want me to do these things to you? Do you want me to, can I convince you to do these things to yourself? Then in some way, you share the blame for it happening to you. It's not just that you were then victimized. I mean, you can think of some wider parapolitical things that this might apply to. It's the notion that, like, in their worldview, it appears to be that they seem to think they avoid some sort of karmic backlash if they do this, or it somehow justifies what they've done. What would you say to this topic? Is this something that is in your worldview?
Well, certainly that consent seems to be required to a degree, not just as a way to get out of charges later on, but even to do the things you want to do if you want to prey on other human beings. And this is, in some ways, maybe it can be seen as literal. But I'm not talking about it literally, because obviously somebody can rape somebody. That's the definition of no consent, or child sexual abuse. But often the predator will use the excuse, "Oh, well, she wanted it, she looked at me," whatever. Or a child abuser can say that the child was flirting with them and that they did want it and they were right. So there may not be a blurry line there, but they can certainly claim there is, and sometimes there even will be a blurry line. And certainly in terms of the psychology of the predator, they may need to blur that line in order to alleviate their own guilt and shame and remorse. So a child abuser basically convinces himself that the child is coming on to him in order to obviously feel that it's not a child abuse. I mean, that's a fairly obvious example. Then there's metaphysical principles, I suppose, or maybe that we don't have to go to metaphysical right away, but certainly if somebody is made conscious that something that they are going to agree to might harm them, and then it harms them, it's the disclaimer thing, then I'd say fairly objectively they are also accountable. Not when they're children, because you could say they didn't have the awareness. You could say that about adults too, but why didn't they? They have a responsibility to be self-aware and to be conscious of what's right and wrong. And if they've lost that moral compass or never developed it, they would also be accountable. So in that sense, the abuser, what have you, the predator would distribute some of the blame or some of the accountability. I think, and then we could extend it further, perhaps, if we wanted to bring it back to what we were talking about before with the trickster thing and the crazy wisdom. We have a guru that basically says, "I'm going to do things that will hurt you, but it's for your own good. Do you agree?" And there's a case of this John de Ruiter, who I wrote a book about, Dark Oasis, who is currently on charges for basically this. Like he persuaded a whole bunch of women to have sex with him, even though many of them were married, and he himself is married, and so on, because he was going to give them some spiritual, blessing through his penis, what have you. And they agreed, and some of them didn't like it, had a bad experience, and now they're charging him with assault or abuse. I think it's assault, actually. And clearly that's going to be a difficult case to prove. Like, they did consent, but then later they didn't like it. Now, if that was so, that was an ordinary situation, although in today's post-woke world, actually, maybe it wouldn't be
true.
court,
Yes.
but certainly it would be harder to press in an ordinary case of a man and a woman. But because he's a spiritual teacher, and because he's convinced his followers that he's essentially God, and if they say no to him, they're saying no to God and to their own souls. You could say that that's coercion. I would say it is coercion. If you're getting them to do something they wouldn't do otherwise, and that's going to be bad for them. And even if it's not going to be bad for them, I don't know. That's tricky. That's a blurry line. But anyway, so that takes it into that area, that person then can feel totally justified in their mind. They're trying to help, and they may even say it is helping, but unfortunately they're resisting the process, and they don't realize that they need an experience like this in order to get free. There's a term they use in this particular group called hell proofing, which speaks for itself, but you have to go through difficult experiences in order to be ready for hell when you die, so you can get through hell as quickly as possible. Now, I happen to think that there's some value in that idea, let's say. I think there's some truth in it.
Sounds a little bit like the thing that the Tibetan monks have about the notion that, you know, you have to prepare your soul vehicle to go into the bardo or whatever it is, you know, like, it sounds like this is a concept that's shared in other traditions, right? Yeah,
and it's actually not that complicated. If you do believe that there's consciousness after death, you can say, well, you know, anything that my body, or my consciousness rather, my identity is attached to in life, comforts and things, I better be ready to let go of those things when I die, because they're not going to be there. So then you could extend that to anything that really bothered me in this life. You know, it might be unresolved, right, etc., etc.
Yes.
So for me, I don't have trouble with that. But the idea that, you know, I'm the one who's teaching you about this, I'm now going to make you hell-proof, that is a very slippery slope.
Yes.
But this very much is behind, I would say, the whole satanic edifice of trauma genesis that we've touched on, that it overlaps with crazy wisdom, like that our overlords. Well, there's two things going on, actually, because mostly I think it's the thing you said. They have contempt for ordinary people, and they think if they're dumb enough to buy into this crap, like we could say, that's what's gone on in the last 3 years in terms of tyrannical social reforms, if they're dumb enough to go along with it, they deserve what they get. I think that is not just the attitude, but the philosophical basis. It's this sort of Darwinian attitude.
Yes.
And you could say it's selection. There's an irony in this, because it would mean that actually those overlords were consciously or unconsciously selecting to survive the people who are smart enough not to go along. So that does raise a question there, that maybe things aren't quite what they seem, but it may just be that they haven't thought it through, and basically they just think nobody's going to be smart enough, and we'll just get all the cattle in line. So that's the main thing that's going on. But at a more subtle level, there does seem to be this trauma genesis rationale, which is we're making you stronger, not as a mass, but individuals who are subjected to trauma in order to open their psychic senses, for example. Like, what's that about? Clearly, they're trying to weaponize individuals to implement their own plans, but they can also have a rationale. They might also, as in the movies, submit themselves to those kind of traumatic processes, like, you know, Hopi Indians or whoever kind of Indians hanging themselves from hooks in order to get into a higher state of consciousness. So then they could certainly say, well, I'm entitled to do it to someone else because I've been through it myself. They might even need to do it to someone else because they didn't recover from, right? So there's a whole bunch of variables in there, or gradations of something that is consistent throughout. In terms of this question of, you know, consent, whether it's manufactured or you know, whatever kind of consent it is, being part of a rationale for the acts of abuse themselves also.
The guy you just mentioned, John DeRuiter, is something I wanted to ask about, because to me, whereas people, like I say, Castaneda just seemed like, even if it was fiction, it was really interesting. Some of the Crowley stuff, it does have connections to, say, like Rosicrucianism, Masonry, things that might be interesting or can be purported to have higher ideals. When I saw the John DeRuiter guy, to me, this looked like one of the most ridiculous, straightforward examples I've ever seen of someone who used all of this trappings as an excuse to make a sex cult. And the funny thing is, though, it actually leads me to a perspective on some of these cult leaders and the concept of the occult that I feel like is really, I don't know if it's just not represented in media or something, but I almost never hear anyone talk about this, which is, you'll notice one of the ways you know a lot of people who've even been in occult circles never really shed the idea of just pure rational materialism. It's because, as I say, when they find like a logical flaw, that disproves the whole thing. When they find, for example, like you look like a classic example to say against someone like Aliester Crowley would be, we did all this magic and like, why couldn't he make more money appear? Why couldn't he do these things? And the weird thing to me is this: if you actually listen to what people are saying and what they say they're doing, they often do tell on themselves. Like, if you think about the axiom that Crowley always purported of like, magic is the science and art of causing changes in consciousness in accordance with will. Well, if you actually look at what he was doing, if you're thinking of this like it's Harry Potter and you're thinking he's physically making things appear, then yeah, he's a failure. He never did any of that. But if you actually look at what he was able to do in his life, which was mooch off every single kind of person that came across his path that was in any way open to his way of thinking, talking, and he would initiate them into his magical orders, sometimes separate, secret magical orders that obviously had his own agendas behind. Like, he did make money appear from nowhere. Like, he made followers appear that were wealthy, that he gave him his money. Then he would use people's bodies for the pleasures that he wanted and the rituals he wanted. In some ways, if you take it as just the idea, like he says, of changing consciousness, and in this case as a science, like, I would say in the modern day, the cleverest thing they've done with occult techniques is they've just secularized them, stripped out all the language that told you it was something supernatural, and it's just sold as normal things. So people in the normal world understand the concept of hypnosis or NLP and these things. But I always tell people, if you ever go and read the first books on NLP by people like Richard Bandler, they're even called like magic or whatever. Like they don't really hide that that's where he's taking some of these ideas. So as far as I can tell, some of the magical art these people were performing was this fucked up relationship and grasp they had over their followers in a way. And this John DeRuiter guy seems like a great example, because I would just say to someone, you said it earlier in the conversation, even if someone did seemingly like disconnect from a certain worldview, the reason why actually reality might be suddenly like traumatic or like terrifying to them is because really they've disconnected from their symbol structure of what the world was and their map of what it was. And it's not the idea that just experiencing reality directly would be good for you. Like, in some ways, people would lose their bearings. Like, what do you think on this angle? Because the John DeRuiter guy, to me, like I say, I didn't even really see what was the cool sort of magical element to his thing. It just seemed like he was tricking women, like you say, into sleeping with him using some sort of quasi-mystical philosophy.
Well, I don't think it was the philosophy that did it. It wasn't for me. And those that because I spoke to a lot of people writing the book and before that.
Was it some sort of charisma? Because I know another thing people often misunderstand is if you've never met these people, you don't know. Like I've met people in my work, which is just video game competitions, and I can tell you there are people who, on the internet, I would tell you 100% it's obvious this guy's lying. But in real life, they do have like almost a magnetic charisma that just, it hypnotizes you, lulls you, and you want to believe what they're saying, you know?
Yeah, and you have to experience it for yourself.
Absolutely.
Cliche. So, because when I saw John DeRuiter, when I heard about him, and then from somebody who did believe that he was extremely powerful in a good way, and then I went to look at him on YouTube, I was rolling my eyes and thinking, oh,
right,
God, and as in thinking less of this person who was praising them.
Yes.
So, but I tried to keep it. Well, I tried to keep an open mind, and then I had this dream vision that night, I believe. So I was completely. My skepticism was underturned, like I could say, violently by an unprecedented sleeping experience, which I don't want to spend too much time on this. But it wasn't enough that when I actually went to see him physically, and listened to him talking to to somebody else, I was still thinking, well, come on, this could mean anything. And so it wasn't until I picked up the microphone and spoke, and then he spoke directly to me. It was really in that moment that it began. I mean, certainly with the dream, obviously in hindsight, but a few days go by and you could say, well, that was probably just a dream, even though it didn't seem like a dream, right? But in this case, it was, I was awake, and he zeroed in on something, and he happened to say, it wasn't uncanny, but he did happen to say something that was exactly in line with what I was thinking about at that time. But it was obviously, it was more than the words. So by the end, and then I went to see him the next day, and the next day I didn't talk to him, and I was really bored with the dialogues, and the people were asking these asinine questions, but rather than focus on that, thinking what a bunch of gormless suckers, I just focused on him, and not even what he was saying, but his physical presence. And he doesn't move, or he didn't in those days, hardly at all. He barely blinked, and I kept equally still. And I was just, I mean, I'm not saying that I used some technique, but I was consciously just trying to tune into him. And by the end of the meeting, 2 hours of stuff, I felt that I had tuned into him physically, and I felt very different physically. I felt in a state of kind of bliss. I felt like my body was very spacious, but much more solid and substance. And I felt this inner peace and this confidence and this immense power. I'm like, wow, this is good stuff. It really was such a strong experience. So those two things, like, okay, there's something here. And then, one thing led to another. Anyway, it's all in the book. I became completely under a spell. And then, but having then spoken to other people, or at least when I became skeptical, I became more interested in what the hook was. But even before that, and speaking to my wife, who was the first one to know, like very many people, a majority even who end up with this guy, have at least equivalent, but often much more dramatic experiences. They go into hallucination.
Oh, right. Okay.
They feel themselves being transported physically. They feel like they're floating. They can't see anything except white light. All of these phenomena going on around him, which doesn't necessarily get talked about. It doesn't get talked about as far as I recall in the meetings, but people who, either they want to persuade others of how great he is, or afterwards they want to explain why they fell for it. These stories, they proliferate. So there's something going on with him that doesn't translate on the video, and it doesn't come. It's not in the words. It might come through the words, but it's not actually in them. So that's my answer. This guy. But the last part is kind of back to the more general. Is you could say that's hypnosis, and I wouldn't argue with it. But then I'd say, well, can you explain to me what hypnosis is?
Sure. Like I say, it's been secularized to seem safe, right? But it actually seems like it's a whole Pandora's box of its own.
Yeah, because I mean, and at what point does if a guy can persuade people to believe things like that, he's that powerful, is he not therefore that powerful?
Yeah, in a sense, right? I mean, one thing I was going to say as you were explaining people's experiences, obviously other people's of hallucinations and things, is do you actually get the sense that he thought he was consciously doing things like that? It wasn't just sort of a byproduct? Like maybe that is the trick, right? Is to make people have these extreme experiences.
That was part of the story. Like,
right.
Somebody would have that experience and then he would smile and say, now you're really getting it.
Right.
He seemed to know when. I mean, it's not that that's mysterious. If you see somebody like eyes going glassy and
sure.
their jaw growing slack, you know something's happening, right? So it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean he's completely on it, but he knows that he can have an effect, and then he can see when the effect has landed, and then he starts using the words that imprint you. Like if you can cause people to go into this other state, you could say it's dissociative, or you could say it's a higher state of consciousness, or both. I don't think it could be both. I think maybe it could be both. And then if you can induce that, and then you can because they get very disoriented. I think you were referring to this just a few minutes back. as they get disconnected from their sense of reality. Who am I? Where am I? What happened? This guy made it happen. He's the guy I'm going to refer to. Help, help. Unconsciously might be, and then the first thing he says, now you're really seeing, or now you know what I am, or now you know what you are, or etc. Those words become imprints, like a baby learning to talk.
Yes. One way I thought we could talk a little bit about Crowley's work, because as you say, I've also, in the last years, not least partly prompted by your own work, investigated some aspects of how that leads into, let's say, bigger parapolitical topics. And it does seem like, at a minimum, there's some very sinister stuff going on there. And in fact, I will even say, even though this is just a side thought for people listening, one of the biggest traps in that very specific domain of these characters I'm talking about is that the second you prod into it, there are already the people there with what I call like the FAQ, the frequently asked questions, who are there to just plaster it all up and make it all look great and just say, oh no, when he says that, what he means is a spiritual truth he's revealing. Of course, the logistics are doing something terrible like that. No one could have done that and gotten away with it. And they have all these like sort of quick fix answers to make you not really consider the sinister part. So I'll put that to one side. I'm mainly asking more about the notion of like actual parts of their work, or in theory, magical truths that they tried to formalize or impart to the world. A question I had goes like this. Another reason I get the sense that a lot of people, it's just the world they've grown up in. They cannot escape this rational materialism, because one of the things they will do, I remember seeing this myself and thinking, oh, it must be all fake, is whenever you look at any Western occultism, so like things like ceremonial magic coming out of Freemasonic orders and Rosicrucian orders, or a classic one, because, I mean, this is so recent, is like Wicca, where if you look, it absolutely has no connection to whatever ancient witchcraft was. It just feigns it. And in fact, a classic trope of these mystery schools in modern day is to claim that your lineage goes back thousands of years to the original ones in whatever Egypt, Babylon, pick wherever you're saying it started. Whereas actually, if you were to use what people would say is like materialist nuts and bolts, like investigative skills, you won't find the connection. But the lens that I wanted to ask about, because I wanted to see what your take on this was, it was actually something a different conspiracy researcher made the point of from some occult experiences they'd had. And it kind of blew my mind, because it made me realize I'm not even actually thinking within the terms of the magical paradigm. So within those ceremonial magic schools, they often stress the notion that there are like magical currents of thinking you can tap into, or you can obviously literally contact certain gods, god forms, whatever you want to describe them as. And the premise this person pointed out was, if you actually take that as a real premise, like you accept that as your starting point and all that implies, then they wouldn't need to actually have a real world sort of like you would in a library, an old scroll that goes back to this year that was based on another scroll. They wouldn't need that. In theory, it's like the idea that if all these external entities, it's like the notion is that magic or the occult would be like inventing a telephone where you could call that entity up and say, hey, right, I know I'm from the year whatever. Essentially, give me the goods. Tell me what you told the people 3,000 years ago, but in my worldview, in my language, etc. And so the notion is like, even though these people could be frauds, and a lot of the things are, again, quite obviously constructed in a way where it doesn't take much to take them apart, if you really believe in the notion of external entities and the notion they impart information or experiences to humans, I mean, obviously that's what most of the myths of how language in every culture come about, that essentially the real world investigative part doesn't invalidate it in that regard. Do you have any experience in this regard or any thoughts?
Well, it would prove that they were lying, though.
Yes, that is true. Yes, unquestionably.
So that's even more, or at least as significant as the fact that they don't have the long lineage or whatever it is that they're claiming, that then you can no longer believe. That may be even less relevant to me than the fact that they're trying to present a story that's false in order to generate the belief. So yeah, because I think one would have to stay on that surely before one went to the next question, unless one did it oneself and said, oh, well, they just made that up because they know that they have contact with the entity anyway, and the entity told them, right? They have carte blanche, really. So I'm not sure where you want to go with this, because we could certainly talk about this thing of entity-based knowledge, and
do you have a perspective on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was thinking of Joseph Smith and Mormonism. Like, did he make that story up, or did he actually get visited? in a way, it doesn't matter because by the fruit shall ye know them. Like, it's pretty clear to me that Mormonism doesn't come from God. But in the context that we're saying, or that we're going into today, it is an interesting question because one is just either a deluded, well-meaning person who got, had a psychotic break and then created a religion, and they're not mutually exclusive, or some kind of entity that a psyop, really, a metaphysical, it could have been an actual social psyop,
Sure.
because they had technology enough in those days.
Yes.
But some sort of psyop, whereby Joseph Smith was singled out for some sort of fake vision, like Whitley Strieber. I'm not saying what happened to him wasn't physically real, but certainly wasn't what he thinks it was, in my view, that would then generate a new tradition. Actually, all the religions have to go back to some sort of entity, if we use entity in a neutral way, or unless we're going to be material reductionists and just say that it was the right hemisphere of the brain or something. But if we give some benefit of the doubt, we've got the Quran came from Gabriel, I think
so, yes.
To Muhammad. The Bible isn't literally delivered by specific angels, but anyway, various prophets that were in touch with various angels, and Moses directly with Jehovah, and so on. There's always got to be some sort of the revelation, which is the communication of the divine. So that's a very broad thing. These magical traditions, they're not really that different, are they? I mean, they might not define themselves as religion, but they might as well, really, because they're defining themselves as a part of a tradition that is sourced in some sort of divine revelation. And you need to sign up now. So my approach, I'm going to say for now anyway, because I think it's accurate, my approach has been maybe two or threefold, but one is, let's look at the source as closely as we can. So that's Joseph Smith, but it's also the moron eye, the Moroni, the angel that supposedly delivered the thing. We can't really look at that very closely, but you can maybe try a little bit. With Crowley, you got Iwaz and you got Lamb, you got these entities that he claimed to be in contact with. But again, harder, but you look at Crowley. But anyway, that's the first thing, is you look at the sources. And then there are three things. The second thing is you look at the social context in which that movement was able to take hold. Did it have assistance? Was it facilitated by structures of power and institutions and so on, which is absolutely the case. Well, it has to be the case because it happened, really. But you could easily map that with Thelema or Mormonism. And then the third one, which is in a way is the easiest thing, is the fruit. Like, what are the results and the consequences of it? And together, I say you can determine, because I'm not sure, I think your question in a way is quite broad. It's like, it's maybe back to the baby in the bathwater. Like, can we find something that's good and true in this, or can we not? I think that may be context, the larger context for it. So I'd say that, well, because you also asked about my personal view. My personal view currently is that there's a reason why, until just 100 years ago, I'd say it was very clear that there were only 4 or 5 religions, right? Whereas now you can put Jedi in your, religion. You can put that in the form for the government, and it's recognized as a religion, a Jedi, whatever. I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, if you love Star Wars, that is now your religion. So there's no even official number of the religions now, but the reason it was limited once upon a time was it had to do with divine revelation, not some counterfeit that comes from Hollywood, and not in between some sort of pseudo-ancient tradition that pertains to entities that aren't kind of kosher. And of course, in today's age, that that can risk just sounding square, well, who determined what who were kosher entities? But I mean, there is some value in tradition. I think more and more people are realizing that now that we've completely divorced ourselves from anything and think we can reinvent the human form. So yeah, I go back to that. I say actually that there's a very limited number of divine revelations, and even they are risky, like, because the Chinese whispers and Christianity, there isn't much left that's good in Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or any of these religions, but at least they have a tradition that you can trace back and say they have an official text, and you can go to the source and corroborate to some degree, and you can practice it without all kinds of bizarre contortions of the human will and the human body, which seems to be required of some of these other disciplines, which are aspiring to be science, actually, or at least the ones that you've mentioned. They have this aspiration, Rosicrucianism and Crowley and Whitley Strieber, even sorcery to a degree. They have this desire to aspire to something beyond religion that actually incorporates science as well, which is to say a methodology. Whereas I think what's consistent with the traditional religions is essentially worship, which I'm not too fond of that word, but surrender. You are surrendering to a higher power and a higher knowledge, and you're giving over, like a guy going to AA meeting at the first thing you got to do, you give over your will to something invisible, not another human being. You recognize. I think that those two things are really key in terms of what's different and what begins the mission creep. As I said, number one, that it's too human based. It's not acknowledging that human beings are basically flawed and they'll always get it wrong. Right?
Sure.
That's in religion, actually. It's totally in Judaism. It's totally in Christianity. Even if you think original sin is a bit iffy, if you think of babies and stuff, but there's still a basis for it. Is that human beings are fundamentally flawed. Even the gospel has Jesus saying, "Don't call me good. I'm just a man." Right? How many Christians remember or quote that? It gets lost in the shuffle.
Yes.
But to me, it's like you take out the main element of religion, which is, surrender and radical humility. I mean, really radical, like God is a mystery. And well, proceed from there. I mean, it's certainly not easy. And this is where the religions become helpful, but also become traps, because they then provide some sort of basis for morality and things. Follow this book and these rules and you'll be okay. Well, it hasn't really worked, but nor has throwing out the book and rewriting a whole new set of rules. Like, that's been even worse, which is why you have something like Jordan Peterson saying, have to go back to the Bible. I don't think he's wrong. I think he does it wrong.
Right.
But the premise is accurate, I think.
One thing that I sometimes struggle with myself, and I will say it as sort of a preamble in this regard, I have an obvious bias because, first of all, any experiences I had, whether it was drug related or meditative, these sorts of techniques, any experience I had that felt like I had some sort of contact with an external entity that didn't appear to just be me or some fraction of myself or anything like that, I found them to in general be, like, at best just mildly sinister and at worst potentially malevolent. Like, that she did seem like there's something a bit disturbing behind them. And I will say, in my profession as a journalist, I do have to unfortunately spend a lot of my time picking apart people's lies and showing that they're corrupt, they have ulterior agendas, and almost no one essentially has, like, altruism in how they're acting, no matter how wonderful they seem. So I do have a bias in this sense, to sort of a paranoid awareness, to use your terminology. But my question would be this, is, if I have to say where I settle at the moment, metaphysically, I sort of vibe more with this notion that in a lot of traditions of, it's less that, like, you're discovering something that wasn't there, and it's more like you are revealing or unveiling what was already there. And so to me, even though it might sound like sort of the like crystal gazing wine ant perspective, I do sort of feel like anything I fundamentally feel is real or has truth behind it or has some sort of meaning that actually can enhance my life, it does feel like it's something that some part of me's remembering that was always there, but I couldn't access it or formalize it or explain it. Whereas when I actually think of like trying to contact external things, something, as I said, when I was a much younger man and I wanted to prove that this was a thing, I was very much open to that idea. I was super into these notions of contacting entities. That almost seems a bit more to me like replying to those like Nigerian scam emails on the internet. It's like you are communicating with something, but it's got some sort of weird agenda you might not initially know. I don't know how much you'll get out of it. And as I said earlier, when I look at the output of people's lives, a lot of the people who claim to have had potentially wonderful experiences with entities, it does seem like it sort of fucked their lives up to some degree. So what is your perspective in this regard?
Well, I also feel, or perhaps more so than you've expressed anyway, that I have had contact with external entities that are hard to explain or non-human, etc., etc. In terms of how useful it's been, I also can't really say that it has.
As much as you can ascertain, did you get a sense that like they had good intentions for you, or it was a positive communication? There wasn't any trap lurking?
Certainly I'd say I couldn't say that there wasn't a trap. I think, the one case I'm thinking of, I might as well focus on that, even though I won't bother describing it. It didn't necessarily feel like this being had intentions at all, except to know me.
Okay.
Or to have interaction with me. And I'm not averse to that. Like if I'm wandering through the jungle or the forest and I come across a strange insect, I want to look at it, or
right.
an animal or a human being. I'll say hello or what have you, right? So and there are other beings out there. And I'm interested and curious. It's only natural, but also they seem to be about us. And so I wouldn't want to say, get thee behind me, Satan, to everything that crosses my path. But I do think, by and large, the common thing is that they do want things from us. That seems to be in the religious texts and in the occult books, for that matter. And that, by and large, I, as an average human, well, I'm not really that average, but anyway, as a human, do want something from them. Like it's very hard not to want. So if one has the possibility of encountering or interacting with some paranormal entity, it's more than just curiosity. It's like, wow, this is transforming my life. If nothing else, what a story this is going to make, kind of feeling around it. And I think that itself is a trap. Absolutely. Like we want to live epic supernatural lives. That was the hook of Castaneda for me and millions of others, of course. And as you were saying about the humans you investigate, and you almost always find it's not altruistic, and there's always, you were making the analogy, why would that be any different in the world of non-human beings? I don't think it is. And why would we think we would know the difference between an angel and a fallen angel, or a demon, or a jinn, or a fairy with glamour magic who can look like, or a succubi that can make itself look like Angelina Jolie or whatever.
Sure.
Right? There's all kinds of artifice in the psychic realms as there are in the physical, and all kinds of traps. So yeah, by and large, I think it is like just look, notice, observe, and carry on. Like a deer would do with us in the forest. A deer doesn't necessarily bolt, but it's certainly not going to come over and say, "Who are you? What do you want?" Unless it's in a Castaneda story. It knows to keep its distance. And why wouldn't we? Why would we think some weird entity? It often is a fear response, and it's not necessarily healthy. But if there wasn't, if there was curiosity was so strong that we wanted to actually get to know this being, that very much could be rash and unwise. I feel personally that I did make pacts with entities during I did that stutter hiss again, specific period of my life, which I think maybe indicated you'd listened to the Chronicles of a False Awakening.
Yes.
I did some podcasts about that period, and it was directly influenced by Crowley in terms of I felt I connected to Lamb, at least. That was one of the entities. And Lucifer was the main one, which doesn't come from Crowley, obviously, that just comes from the culture at large. And that I consciously made certain pacts with those entities, not explicitly for power, but it was in there. You know, I wasn't some craven individual driven for power over my fellow men like a supervillain. I was more like a misguided superhero or wannabe superhero. You see, if you give me great power, I will be responsible with it and I'll do great good. But still, it was in there. And I feel that since that time, which is 16 years, no, 20 years, I'm still trying to get out of those contracts. Actually, I think that they were probably made at a much younger age, and I was just become more consciously enacting something. I don't really believe that if you do a parchment and a talisman and a tattoo and the kind of things I did and shave your head, you're cementing some pact with entities. They can make you believe that, and that's why you do it. And then
right, psychological, right?
And then that belief keeps you.
Yes.
I don't believe it now, but I do believe that what drove me to do all that was something that's not in the realm of consciousness, that's from an earlier time. And so I'm still somewhat bound by a pact that I made prior to that time that was unconscious, and I'm still trying to undo it. And so, I mean, that's just a good point to end on. That in my understanding of these entities, pacts, most of them happen when we're children, and we make pacts with imaginary friends who are entities, who are real entities as children, and don't ever realize it to get out of them. That's what I think now.
Right. One thing I actually find it's funny that so many people look at like the flooding of media, even sometimes overtly, with conspiracy themes or things that when you or I might have looked into in like the 1980s, you had to subscribe to some obscure zine or find the internet when it first came along, or hear almost like an urban legend of those things. And they were actually considered very secretive, taboo, transgressive, right? When people see this stuff flooded into the mainstream now, they actually see this as a positive, and they see it's like, oh, it's like a great awakening. Like, oh, the truth's coming to light. But the problem I have with that whole thing is, to me, it's more like the limited hangout or managing perception angle of things. And I like the phrasing you used earlier of like calling the people who empower the controllers, as it were. Because when I look at that, one of the things I find actually quite mundane about a lot of conspiracy thinking is, essentially, to use your analogy, they've just escaped the first matrix, and then they don't ever question that they're in a second matrix. So first of all, when they have like a notion, because I've noticed built into that, like a religious worldview, is there are saviors. There are, I'll use the terminology because people get it. There are white hats. There are people out there who might even appear to be the bad guys, but really they're sort of wink and a nudge. They're trying to like help us along or spur us on to illumination or whatever you want to say in that sense. The problem I have with that thinking is, not only does it seem unexamined, and I can see from your work you've gone in some of these areas, but some of my own investigations into those areas and those people show me that there are much more sinister things going on, even behind some of these individuals, than the mainstream perception of it. There's a conspiracy, there's a group, they do X, Y, and Z, they do it for money, or they do it for sex, or degeneracy, whatever it might be. Even behind that, so to me, even if there is some kind of a white hat type figure, someone who wants to help us or save us or nudge us in the right direction, they could be an entity, they might not even be human. On some level, even they are directly using deception, which, to bring it back to what you were talking about earlier, that is always like a red flag for me. When someone sort of leads with deceiving me in some way, potentially in a malicious way even, that does sort of make me think like, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to take from what you're telling me here, even if there is truth mixed in there. Do you actually get a sense are there any white hats in the world? Are we white hats by even talking about these topics?
Well, I don't know how famous you are, but I'm certainly not famous. I don't even have a wiki page. I did have one actually, but I created it myself, and then somebody took it down.
Okay.
Somebody on the inside, probably somebody in my family. And I'd say that, well, I'll just stop for a minute, because it is unclear now with internet culture. You have internet celebrities who it's not clear that they've been assisted.
Okay.
But they have been assisted by the algorithms at least. But I think it is a subtler point I want to make anyway, because you can still look at those YouTube celebrities and without research, maybe you don't research whether they've been assisted by shadowy figures, or you research and you don't find, but you can still look at the content and see how are they proceeding, what is their methodology, because if we're talking about entities, they can by definition, within this hypothesis of entities that can possess and manipulate human beings, they can make somebody a celebrity or make somebody into a well-positioned apparent white hat without using human agencies to do it. You can just do it directly by influencing and shaping that person's communications. And so what I'm getting to is that my view is that my position is that, and I've kind of had to take this through years of struggle and failure to get more prominent, that if you are shaping your methods of communication in order to achieve some sort of worldly mission, like to awaken people, let's say, your prime game for the kind of entities or psychological patterns that are just trying to achieve worldly status for your own ego.
Yes.
Like who could really draw a line there, like me wanting to be a Hollywood filmmaker to deliver a message, right? It's a blurry line, but either way, with either of those motivating things, you're going to start shaping and customizing your message in order to have that effect, in order to be more effective at a worldly level, right? So then you're censoring, then you're controlling your own expression. And that's not the soul. Like the soul can't be censored, it can't be controlled, it can't be modulated or customized in order to appeal to other consciousnesses in any form, actually, I would say, but certainly not at a worldly or a social level. Like the soul doesn't give a flying fuck about social stuff.
Sure.
Being liked. I mean, I'm speaking for the soul now because I'm trying to speak with the soul, but hopefully I don't have to extrapolate on that. Let's just say it's feral. It's like a feral kind of consciousness within us that just needs to express. You call it the id if you prefer, but it's more than just the unconscious. It's like really the lion's share of what we are, and that's been more and more my goal is to be raw and uncensored and expressing from my soul in every interaction. But it has really been from the start. It's just that I spent many years trying to suppress it for a number of different reasons, including obviously unconsciously because I was afraid of what would come out, but also consciously, in a way, consciously, because like I said, I created different personas. I split myself so that one guy could get famous in Hollywood while the other was ringing the bell, the apocalypse bell, and saying the end is nigh. That was me splitting myself and censoring in certain ways because I had this mission or this goal that compromised that expression. So that's my very long, very general answer. Why I don't believe there are any white hats, let's say Jordan Peterson, someone people care about, who seems like self-created and not. I mean, obviously the internet created him, but he doesn't. Actually, it's untrue because I just found out that he was on the board at
he had some very powerful influences.
The
he was working
UN.
with the UN, exactly, yes.
Yeah, before he became famous. So
Yes.
actually, he's not a good example. I don't know who would be then. Joe Rogan. I don't know. You can probably find somebody who he was quite famous before he podcasted.
Are you sort of implying then that essentially if there was some kind of an entity or a being that actually, even if they had good intention, essentially the fact that they would want to be worldwide famous in the very human social world is almost a giveaway that that isn't them, it's fraudulent?
Yeah, well, yeah, but that's
Right.
kind of low-hanging fruit, I suppose.
Sure.
But rather than saying famous, if you say somebody who wants to be a world reformer, actually, I mean, this seems kind of low-hanging fruit too, because if you really think that the world can be reformed, then you're delusional.
Yes.
So So then don't trust somebody who's
Sure.
or I mean, it's the same point in a different way. If your focus is on the world, then you're not focusing on the eternal, or on the soul,
Yes.
or on yourself for that matter. I mean, at least be focused on yourself at all times. Like, what's happening for me? Why am I doing this? Why am I saying this? Is this true? I don't see we have if we have any extra space to put our consciousness on the world in terms of, I mean, I'm not saying you become solipsistic. One has to check. Like, I'm constantly, I don't have video. That's one of the reasons I like video, but checking to see if you're following along, if
Sure.
I'm connecting. I'm not just talking like, in a can that's just to create a recording for an interview. I'm talking to you.
Yes.
So I want to be constantly aware of if I'm communicating. So I'm not saying that is obsolete or redundant, but the main focus is on myself and what I'm saying, and does it feel true, and does it feel real? I mean, that's a 24/7 process. This Socrates calls it self-examination, but I'll say conscience, constantly checking in with one's conscience. Is this true? Is this honest? If that's your main thing, I don't see how you'd ever become successful, not really, because there's too, I mean, Jordan Peterson can cry on camera and it's going to make him even more famous, but that's kind of an act too. I mean, it's not, I don't know why I'm picking on Jordan Peterson. I actually quite like him, but there's just something, it's like a whoreness, that starts whoring itself as soon as it's
performative on some other, right?
Yeah. And that's like, you can be a white hat in the sense that you're doing observable good at a social level, but what's the deeper effect? Like, Jordan Peterson clearly helped a whole bunch of young men to feel better about themselves, but what's the long-term result? Like, what did those young men do with what they got? Jordan Peterson, where are they now, et cetera, and what did it do for Jordan Peterson? Overall, can we say, from a spiritual perspective, not a social perspective, that was good? I don't see that we can, but you'd have to really care enough to dig into it. I did actually dig into Jordan Peterson for a while. But anyway, again, it's an individual level. Just because 1 or 100 or even 1,000 young men have really been helped by Jordan Peterson doesn't mean that the overall phenomenon called Jordan Peterson itself is wearing a white hat.
Yes, it could obviously still serve an agenda. Right. One question I had along the topic of Whitley Strieber, who's obviously been a massive figure in your work as well, is this is someone where initially I would have never had any interest, because even when I used to think back in sort of the 90s of the idea of like aliens or UFOs, I was essentially just thinking of the X-Files. Like, it wasn't something that had happened to me or anyone I knew. It was just sort of a cool idea. And I will say, in the modern day, the idea of like literal crafts that come from other worlds containing other species of entity that live in the universe but not in our part, to me, I don't even find that interesting at all. Without going down rabbit holes, I just noticed that essentially I'd explain it like this: it's always presented to you ass backwards to me, which is they present it as, oh, what happened was, the reason this is a real phenomenon, that these entities come to our world and interact with humans, is because all cultures talked about external entities, but maybe they saw them as angels. Well, I think it's the other way around. I think essentially, if you go down the rabbit holes, you find that all modern science, and especially everything to do with space travel and these topics, comes directly from the occult. Like, it is literally not only occult spiritual ideas within those mystery schools magically manifest as literally what we're supposed to believe is the reality of our universe, but even concepts like the word universe, world, like some of these concepts are like, they're very deep, like actual spiritual concepts or occult concepts. And as far as I can tell, it's the other way around. Like, essentially, the reason they show you, again, it's secularization. The reason they show you the alien and tell you it's like it's a being like you, and it just came on like a really cool, like we have like an aeroplane or a spaceship. They have like a better version. It's a way to make you relate to it and make it seem safer, or it doesn't have a spiritual component. Whereas I would say, I noticed first of all on almost every aspect of the UFO cultology reinforces modern scientific thinking and modern scientific paradigms. Like, for example, when people say, well, the reason there has to be aliens is, like the universe would be too big for us to be alone. It's like, so what you're basically saying is, there's got to be like a god or some sort of external entity, but instead of you reaching for it spiritually, you just assume it's on a different part of an enormous map that you can't ever reach. Like, that actually just takes what is your natural impulse, as far as I can tell, and puts it down a specific paradigm that has a specific set of agendas, end goals for what they want you to think about. So to me, it's actually a lot easier to get interested in someone like Whitley Strieber, as you're maybe implying, if you view it as some sort of entity contact or some sort of repressed memory or something along these lines. Like that's a lot more interesting to me, because I can understand the idea of having external experience, or that it could manifest in a certain way to communicate to you. What is your current take on the Whitley Strieber phenomenon? Clearly you think some of it's nonsense, or some of it was delusion, maybe some of it was to sell later books, but is there an essence there that sticks out to you, that seems like there's something important there?
Well, you left out PSYOP, which we
of course, yes,
explored recently with the Joseph Smith stuff, and then I referred to Whitley Strieber. So I think it's very, very useful, very, very interesting, and maybe why I feel that Prisoner of Infinity is in some ways my most complete, or the most effective lens that I've written as a book to look at our world. I'm hoping Big Mother is on the same level, but we'll see, because it incorporates a number of different levels of PSYOP, and some very basic and profound beliefs, as you've touched upon, like fundamental beliefs in higher powers and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So let me think about it for a second. How do I look at it now? Because, I mean, when I wrote Prisoner of Infinity, it was a bit of I was skirting around the question of whether Strieber encountered objectively real, at least sometimes physical, non-human beings, and whether that element was necessary to explain, to account for his stories. Because I certainly was never wanting to even try to just call the guy a liar. I mean, I just never felt that he was simply a liar.
Oh, right. You thought there's a genuineness to it.
There is, yeah, there is. I have caught him in a number of lies, or I do in the book, or at least blatant contradictions that if he hasn't owned up to, he's lying simply by not acknowledging them. They're like Castaneda there, but there's something beyond sincerity actually in what he's doing. You could say it's just a consummate performer, and that's always a possibility. But it isn't simply that. That isn't all the question is either. It's like, I mean, there's even the recordings of those original hypnosis sessions, and I just don't even try to go there. It would just be too elaborate and less convincing, actually, if you tried to say that it was just a very elaborate bit of theatre that covered decades and hundreds of individuals and so on. So something happened that had a physical development element that he believed absolutely involved non-human beings, that he drew and had somebody paint a painting of, and that he never said was extraterrestrials, but they were definitely visitors from somewhere else, as he put it, and so on and so forth. However, it's all, as I explore in Prisoner of Infinity, it's all nested within a much larger, much longer program of social engineering, which is to do with the creation of beliefs in order to create reality. If you get people to believe things, they will act on the beliefs and do things that then generate realities. It might not be the same reality they believe in the sense if they believe in aliens, it doesn't mean the aliens will come.
Sure.
But for example, if you do believe in aliens, you're going to be more interested in space travel.
Yes.
And so I mapped the intersection between the whole UFO thing and the promotion of space travel, space technology, and so on. Those two things are inseparable, I think, or they need to be connected anyway, or seen as connected. So I forgot where I was going with that now. the social engineering, etc. So there, well, I'm not sure if this is where I was going, but there are provably, demonstrably groups and factions, etc., involved in this whole area, not just space travel, but abduction as it's become known and described and defined, but also in Strieber's life. That's really clear.
Oh, right.
Indisputable. He will admit it. Did I work for the CIA? I don't know. Did I?
Right.
He's all over the map in this regard. So that's very briefly, that's the mundane level that is compelling, but it doesn't account for everything in my view. So I did eventually, in a certain sense, reluctantly, I do refer to, okay, there is an element here that we can at least speculate is non-human. But if so, it's complicit with all of these agendas. It clearly is, because it's instrumental. If it's part of what's happening to Strieber, and it's using Strieber to create these narratives, these books that generate narratives in the world, in society, that then form this create this social contagion and the mass formation of this larger body of belief and of activity, then whatever entities these are, they're involved. And then there's the methodology of the entities, which by Strieber's own account repeatedly, and now Jeffrey Kripal has become the leading academic advocate of it, is traumagenesis. The more they beat up Paul Whitley, the more they tortured him, the more his consciousness evolved. That's it in a nutshell. That, I'd say, is the rationale of an evil force in the world. I mean, maybe it has a good result in the end at some level, but certainly at the purely human level, I think we've seen enough, or there is enough evidence, whether we've looked at it or not, that trauma does not lead to any kind of opening of consciousness, or it might, if you get through it to the other side. At the very end of the day, you might say, well, I'm actually... by being traumatized and having to face it and become whole in a conscious way, that's an even better result than if I'd just been not traumatized and become whole in a natural, easy way. I don't know, but it seems a stretch in itself, because it would take a lot longer, obviously. If you didn't have the trauma, you'd just go straight to wholeness. So without denying that there's a reason that trauma happens, and you can't just say it shouldn't happen and be simple-minded, to go so far as to actually reify it or reframe it or spin it as some tool for which higher level beings or which higher level beings are using to evolve us, that's horrific. And Strieber doesn't seem to show any awareness of it, or at least he says it seems horrific. I know it seems horrific, but you have to think beyond your old dated religious concepts of angels and demons, because these are angels sometimes and they're demons at other times. I used to believe this kind of stuff, partly through Strieber. So then, if there are, I would say there are beings involved in this, and that and this is very speculative, but you've asked for speculation.
Yes.
That they seem to me, or at least the easiest way to talk about them seems to me is in context of Islam and jinn, which is because that's more neutral. Like Islam recognize that there are entities that are neither angels nor demons, really, or a bit of both, or what have you. But it doesn't, in this sense, it doesn't matter. That the point is that they were created by God, and there's a spectrum of them. Actually, this is consistent with what Strieber says about the visitors. Some of them are good and some of them are evil. But anyway, they're definitely not like us, and in any sense or form, where Strieber tries to argue sometimes that they are us in the future, or they're our family, or they're our evolved potential, and so on and so forth. Whereas I think the Islam thing would be more like, no, you don't really want to get mixed up with the jinn, because they're constantly tricking and able to appear like something else, and so on. I'm getting a bit of a headache talking about it. To me, we're talking about a very high level of second matrix, very, very high level. Like, I suppose you mentioned Bardo realm. So a kind of illusory reality, that's an oxymoron, but anyway, illusory realm that does transcend the physical and therefore could extend beyond the life of the body. I'd say that that's the game of these entities.
I do actually have one last question, which will be about Kubrick and your new book. But just as a response to what you were saying there, I have a rare occasion where maybe I can bring something to the table that might interest you, which is in my world, which is the esports world, which essentially people could just think of it as in the same way as, little kids play football. There is obviously an organised sport called football with punditry and analysis and interviews, and it's its own world. Essentially, that's what esports is for video games. So I only follow like very specific video games within the umbrella of esports, but I can tell you a very interesting observation I had through my decades in that field is that essentially the best country in the world for playing esports games, hands down, is South Korea. And one of the reasons why, without going into the whole thing, is they had this whole thing when they had their economic boom in the 90s, where when they got technology, there's still a lot of poor people, and there's a lot of people whose actual average salary isn't that high. So people didn't, like maybe you or I, get a PC as a home tool that was in their bedroom that they did whatever on. You had these PC cafes, it's still a thing to this day, that are very cheap. They cost like $1 an hour. You go there, you don't even buy the games. You typically just play the games that are installed already. So it'll be something like StarCraft or League of Legends, these quite famous games, FIFA. You play the games there, and it's almost like equivalent to what an arcade was when people were younger in the West. And because of this, in their culture, they have a very, very extreme work ethic culture. Like it's beyond Protestant work ethic, like self-mutilation thinking. In their culture, for real, there's a reason why they either excel at things like academics or business, or they quite literally, you can look it up, commit suicide. Like they really are one of those cultures where you like it's not a joke. The dad would say to you, why did you get a B? Whereas maybe in the West, they might go, you got a B, go for an A next time. No, it's like you had to get the A. You had to be the best. So these things combined, like when they have these PC cafes, for example, even though actually becoming a pro gamer is very looked down upon, you are supposed to become a businessman, a doctor, some very high status, money earning capacity. What they do is the reason why the players become amazing at the video games is because you say to your parents, I'm going to the library to do my schoolwork. You leave the house, you take the $2 they give you for a snack or something, you go to the PC cafe with your friends, you play the game, and because you've got an extra fire under your arse, if this doesn't work out for you and you've just wasted years doing that and your school grades go down, you've essentially destroyed your life. You've become a social outcast, you've been known. So when you play the game, you're not just playing for fun. You better play to become the absolute best you can and grind the game. And as a result, at the competitive level, another quick thing to add is they have a very homogenous culture. I actually lived there for a few years. Like in their country, all of them are watching the same TV shows, listening to the exact same K-pop song, following the same stories about celebrity. There's not like a lot of sort of like mainstream media diversity, as it were. So like you can have this interest or this one. It's like everyone's all into these few things. So they're very extreme and intense at the things they're all trying to do. So if you ever look in any esports game in which Koreans tried to be the best, like they had enough people obsessed with that game, 1 or 2 games at a time in their culture, they just become the best in the whole world. Part of it can be put down to, like I said, this work ethic, almost the idea that you've got like a sword of Damocles waving over you, where if you don't become the best, you've ruined your life with your parents and your social circle. But then there's also the factor that they have this insane work ethic to grind. Like even the best player is just grinding all the time. They own, ironically, some of them are practicing like 14 hours a day. And what I will say is this, because I'm going to tie this into what you were talking about. You've mentioned a few times where people will imply maybe trauma or initially negative experiences are necessary to sort of spark growth. Well, what I would tell you is this. There have been so many Western figures, people in America, people in Europe, who see this approach where the absolute best Koreans basically grind themselves to oblivion. And I'll tell you, the majority don't make it. In fact, the majority you will never hear of within this world. You get the rare few that can sort of handle it. They can just, I wouldn't even say it's positive, mate. They just become excellent at the game, impossibly good, but they can just essentially handle the mental strain. Now, they are extremely rare. And I have to say, my own experience implied they were probably extremely autistic. I say that as someone on the autism spectrum myself. They seemed like they were just different from the average person trying it. And I will tell you, along the way, the actual like casualties of this approach are horrific. Like, even though I love watching this high level of play the very good player can get to, for everyone who makes it there, forget hundreds, it might be tens of thousands ruined their lives doing this or put in 99% of the same effort and never got the same results. And so when the Westerners would look at this and do that sort of corporate thinking of like, well, we've got to work smarter, not harder. No one's ever done it, mate. No one's ever been able to actually figure out a way you can practice less and without it being this insane grind and be better than these Koreans. So essentially, the only efficacy they can show is that it does make you the absolute best at the game. But what I'm getting at is it appears to also ruin every other aspect of your life and personality. Like at the end, all you are is a vehicle to play the game. You're just a person playing the game at the highest level. When that's over, your life and your career is sort of done. You don't have a developed personality, as you can imagine. In fact, a lot of them are kind of stagnant, almost like from the point they began obsessing about the game because they haven't had a proper girlfriend, a social life. They've never worked another job. And so what I would say is I understand that this is built into the sort of occult philosophy. Like if people know the work of Gurdjieff, the reason he could justify all the kind of fucked up things he did to his followers is it was almost like he was trying to get you to enact your spiritual second wind, as it were, or push you into a state of consciousness that was heightened. Because, I mean, obviously this ties into those Indians you talk about. When they experienced the extreme pain, they would say it sort of maybe activates like the third eye or some kind of a consciousness elevation to a certain way of thinking that you wouldn't experience without that forcing you. But I would just say from my own observation of it, whatever it brings out of it doesn't seem worth it, mate. Like even if essentially you could be the best at something or had the spiritual truth, it seems like the price you pay in this Faustian bargain is everything that actually mattered in your experience.
Yeah, and what's the end result? It sounds more like that game is just looking for people to play it as well.
It almost sounds demonic, yeah, doesn't it? It sounds like they just want like vehicles to just operate in the real world, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought I'd pass that comment. I thought he might be interested because it's kind of a unique way to attack it, you know?
Well, it segues with the Kubrickon, doesn't it?
Yes, so here's the question I have about Kubrick, right? Obviously, I read some of the articles around this book. I'm looking forward to reading this. It looks like it's going to be another banger, mate. But obviously, there are certain topics. I always say there's certain cursed words I try not to say, not just for algorithms. I just feel like because of what they symbolically mean to people and they're already preloaded, so I call them cursed words. I feel like if you just say those words, people stop listening and their brain goes off into a different direction and it just causes a lot of problems. Whereas I find when you talk more abstractly, you can sort of get through to people in a way where they'll consider things without the scary words hitting them. So what I want to ask about the Kubrick angle goes like this. He is obviously presented, and I notice this is another trope in mainstream media, he is always presented, and one of the things that makes him so appealing, quite frankly, to my personality type, is that he's always presented as the ultimate outsider. He wasn't part of the Hollywood system. You have to understand, they didn't even like it, but he was just so good. You know, they had to let him do it. By the way, I'm sure you know this, but there's the exact same storyline with Alan Moore in comics. It's like, oh, he was the best comics writer, but then he sort of was outside the system, but then he was so good, they had to keep selling his comics and they have to keep making the movies about his stuff. And it's like, the problem with that is, to use the whole second Matrix analogy, is like, that's just a cover story in itself, as far as I can tell. I mean, it seems like that's what you're alluding to here. Like, he wasn't really, like, it's a great story. He wasn't really just a guy living in some mansion in England thinking 14 hours a day about what he's going to do on this movie and what every piece of carpet should look like. Clearly, whether he was conscious of it or not, some of the things he did as this supposed outsider TM, just like I would say with the work of Alan Moore, which has absolutely had enormous impact on people's imaginations and brought occult ideas sort of under the door, as it were, without them knowing it and thinking it's just characters. It does appear that whether he knew it or not, his work serves agendas that are much, much more than just make a cool movie, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you said it for me. Thanks there, Duncan.
Fair enough.
Do I have to add anything?
Well, essentially, maybe you can jump off that and tease us into, like, what approach did you take to find some of the stuff for the book, or what sort, without going too deep in the rabbit holes, what sorts of areas do you consider that people maybe don't know about this character? Like, it's not just a biography of Kubrick, essentially.
No, it's not. It's not at all. Actually, it's almost as though Kubrick is just a necessary means to an end. The egg that I had to break for the omelette of Kubrickon, the book, I mean, and that may be the case in other ways. Like Kubrick himself was a tool for something. I mean, that's largely central to my premise, I think. So what interests me about why I wrote the Kubrickon, it wasn't really primarily to expose something about Kubrick, unlike, say, Vice of Kings with Crowley and the whole British establishment, or Prisoner of Infinity and Strieber. I didn't really have much of a stake in the game of exposing Kubrick. I mean, I had some, but I had some as a film writer, because I always felt that his movies were being praised unjustly, and I don't like to see injustice when it comes to aesthetic evaluations, or I didn't back then. But it became, that was less relevant to me by the time I started writing the Kubrickon, which was years before it published. When Kubrick started becoming the second Matrix figure in conspiratainment circles on YouTube and podcasts, like he's this great architect of something. And
I mean, they sort of imply he was a white hat, right? And he's sort of trying to give you messages in the movie to open you up to truths, right?
Overall, the view of these types is sometimes it's ambiguous, and they might even say that he's corresponds with Satan or Saturn or something like that, and he's not to be trusted, but they still will study the movies endlessly. So I definitely felt some sort of despair around that, like good minds going to waste watching endless hours of Kubrick footage, or sifting through endless data points around Kubrick's life and so on. That kind of obsession, it distressed me a little bit to think about, but also it made me curious, like, why are these people getting so obsessed? And it's a bit like I said about John de Ruiter, like, how did Kubrick, in this case, how did he generate obsession? Because the obsessors, of course, are saying that there's a reason for the obsession. They don't even like the word obsession to be used because it has a negative connotation. Yes. They'd say that something's going on in Kubrick movies that is worth their attention and our attention, and they're doing the shit work, the trench work of digging it all up and presenting to us so we can benefit from these mysteries. But my point of view was, I went meta. I said, no, Kubrick did something intentionally in his movies that you're missing, which was to generate obsession. Kubrick's purpose was precisely the thing that has happened to you. The thing you're trying to find.
That was the effect, the intended effect.
Yeah, you're not seeing the thing you're trying to find because you've been taken over by it. So, and then that led to the question, or I had to then continue my thesis as to why. Why did Kubrick create movies, or design movies, is my thesis, scientifically design movies in order to generate obsession in the viewer? And the answer included his awareness of the internet. He knew that at a certain point, DARPA, the what's it called, the DARPA net would become the internet, and that the movies that he'd designed collectively would begin to interface with the internet, or get spliced with the internet, and thereby interface with human consciousness in new ways, not just in movie cinemas for a couple of hours here and there, but on this sort of constant obsessive rewatching over and over again. I mean, DVDs and VHS would have been congruent with this, that people could watch the movies over and over again and freeze frame and rewind and do all this stuff. But the internet's the ultimate opportunity, or the landing pad, for this kind of immersion of consciousness in the media that he created, that he foresaw would allow for a splicing of human consciousness with his movies, you could say, but that's a bit abstract because his movies don't exist as outside of the perception of them. It's like the tree in the forest. I mean, they exist in a DVD or a file on a thing, or images on a screen, but the world of the movie doesn't have any physical existence. It's just an image. So how does that splice with consciousness? Well, that's a metaphysical thing. If people watch images, they do go into their body and into their psyche. So that splicing would have been happening from the start. But talking about deepening that by the repeated immersion, but the crucial element is the technology, because it's interactive technology. This is an element too, as opposed to just sitting in front of a screen. The Kubrick files are interacting with the material, they're re-editing it, they're writing exegesis, they're watching it frame by frame and so on. So they're becoming more and more proactively engaged with merging their consciousness with it, and thereby, because they're using the technology to do that, they're merging their consciousness with the technology, but it's their consciousness that's informed by the Kubrick thing, by that obsession that the images are generating, as well as the images themselves. So anyway, the thesis is that combination of these elements causing a synthesis between human consciousness and machine technology of the internet is what Kubrick foresaw would be a means to create artificial intelligence. Not exclusively, I hasten to add, but along with these other elements, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, Twitter,
right,
etc., all of these other elements that are also about fusing human consciousness with the machine in order to generate artificial intelligence out of living intelligence or true real intelligence, thereby making human beings less intelligent and the machine more intelligent, in quotes. I mean, more functioning, more able to pass the Turing test. And all of this was the problem that he formulated for himself while working on 2001, because how, as conceived by him and Clarke, was artificial intelligence without enough humanness in it, and it would destroy human beings. Like that premise, I guess I'm saying that Kubrick recognized or believed that was a real problem. If we're going to create AI, how are we going to stop AI just exterminating all humans? And this was part of the solution. That hence the generating of obsession. It's not enough to just for AI to gather to gather data from human beings and thereby simulate consciousness. It has to gather a kind of data that's very specifically human and subjective. It's not just facts; it's feelings as well. Right? The AI has to simulate feelings too, and so he posited that. It's ironic, I hadn't thought of this, but he made movies that don't have much feeling and they don't generate feeling, but nonetheless, compared to just ordinary, information, and they do generate obsession, and that in itself is feeling. So you could say he was trying to generate a higher level of feeling, as opposed to a rom-com, the Titanic or something that can make people cry, a movie can make people laugh, but he's aiming for a deeper level of human subjective feeling experience, which is this obsessive, like something's happening here, the feeling. I'm kind of making this up now, but in a way the whole Kubrickon is me attempting to intuit something based on a whole bunch of facts. So I'm just continuing to do that now, that quality of really focused subjective attention is what he decided, or he and whoever he was working for or with decided was going to be central to creating artificial intelligence as a working program for social control, and thereby his movies would become instruments of something that would accelerate that program, and that's the Kubrickon.
Right, I have one last sort of final set of comments, and then if you have any more, the final words will belong to you. What I would just say, especially thinking about some of the things you're talking about here, is that's actually one thing I've never heard many other people say this, because obviously within film circles, he is absolutely revered as almost like some iconic godlike auteur. In fact, he's basically what everyone thinks of when they think of an auteur. I also had a similar experience, which is when I first watched his films as a young man, I remember thinking like, is this just some poser shit that everyone's telling me this guy's the best? Like, I'm watching these movies, and as you say, they're kind of cold. Like, where's the humanity in these films? Like, as I grew older, yes, I could see this aesthetic brilliance there. He clearly has an amazing cinematographic eye. He understands how to put shots together and lighting. And some of these things, as your palette for these techniques grows, yes, there's a lot there. Similarly, some of the stories have very interesting implications as social commentary or things about like interactions of institutions. But I have to say, I always got the vibe early on that it was a bit like, I'll use an analogy here since you're English as well. It reminds me of of when you will sometimes meet Americans. It's the kind of American who doesn't know that, like, even American comedy has sarcasm and subtones and stuff. They think that, like, American comedy is all just obvious and slapstick, and British comedy, though, they're always thinking of, like, Monty Python or something. They think, like, oh, I've heard it's, like, brilliant and it's, like, very deep and, like, the jokes are, like, complicated. And so you'll meet a type of American who will laugh at things you say that weren't funny and weren't jokes, because they think, just because they don't know what you're talking about, that, oh, shit, they're doing one of those English jokes. Like, oh, yeah, oh, you're just kidding, of course. Whereas maybe you actually might just be an arsehole to them. You might just be, like, fucked off with them. So I always got a little bit of that sense out of the movies. And then I would tie that into the reason in the modern day I do find his work to have something of a sinister undertone is, without diving into the specific rabbit holes, if I was to write down a list without thinking of Kubrick of, like, the top 10 psyops of the 20th century, he seems to either be putting them on screen or maybe even causing their, like, emergence into mass consciousness, sometimes seemingly directly. Like, he's sometimes even the first guy to put those things into a movie or on camera, or these implications. So then again, these are just observations I have. Now, final words belong to you if you have anything more to say.
Gosh, well, I don't want to say any final words about Kubrick, so I'll have to just
Sure.
non sequitur it away.
Yeah, sure.
That last summation, although I imagine it will raise questions in some of your listeners' minds, but that's always good to leave them with questions.
Yes, exactly.
My usual desire to sum up, not to sum up, but to say something at the end, has to do with, well, I'd say there's two things actually. The first one is just make contact. Like, I'm glad that you made contact. It was unexpected. I mean, I hadn't heard of you. I'm sure you won't be offended.
No, of course not.
Esports is definitely not my domain. I see you have a very large following in that domain.
It's very niche, though. Don't worry, mate.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting that you had known about me since Stormy Weather, but it's 15 years later. And until we made contact, and I'm glad we made contact. Whether or not it leads to anything beyond this, there's some fruit in this conversation, and to me, that's really the only demonstrable fruit. I mean, yeah, it's good to get a review here and there, but that rarely happens anyway. But as if I actually hear from individuals, and so. I'm always hoping when I do a podcast that it will reach one or two or three or four or five people in a much deeper way than it reaches the rest, and those are the ones I hear from. Like, it's like we were saying in a much darker way about that Korean video game. You know, it takes thousands and thousands of broken spirits to get the one champion. Well,
yes,
I feel I have to reach hundreds and hundreds of eyes and ears to just reach one or two people that really are going to connect and receive and have something to exchange with me. So I'm speaking to those ones now. If you're out there and if you're hearing, I would like to hear from you. I am doing one-to-ones, but also group meetings. I've got one tomorrow. So reach out, email Jason with a U at protonmail.com. Just love to hear from anyone who actually wants to pass through the fourth wall and make contact. And the second thing is actually what tomorrow's meeting is about, which has to do with what I'm involved in off the internet. And I haven't been doing a great deal of talking or sharing about it on my website, Land Made Man, even though that was the whole point of that website, was to share my process of extracting myself from ordinary society and making moves, steps, one by one, you know, month by month and year by year, to becoming self-sufficient and living on the land. I mean, we're a very long way from self-sufficiency. Currently, everything we eat pretty much comes from the local grocery store. But nonetheless, we're living more or less in the middle of nowhere. We have goats and chickens, and we're growing stuff, and there's a lot of land and quite a large property. And we're working on building other properties that in the time of the great the real refugee movement, when the Babylon starts to fall, it'd be too late by then, I think, to get out of Babylon. So I'd say get out sooner rather than later. I'm not saying come to Spain, because there could be hundreds of people that respond to that part of the message, although I doubt it. But that we are involved in trying to make that easier, even if just by example. So we haven't got into that at all. So my view there, and what tomorrow's meeting is about, is that the spiritual path, which we've touched on a number of times, and I don't even like the word path, but anyway, the things we've been talking about today, like the way to know oneself and to connect to one's soul, has to do with, I did touch on it with the comment about carpentry, has to do with a return to a more primordial engagement with physical reality, free from the trappings of culture. And that just starts with some very simple things. For me, it started with house renovations, and then with running a thrift store in a small town in which I constantly had to interact with physical objects that I didn't want and like, and some that I did, and human beings that I didn't want to interact with and didn't like. So it was a crash course in just, becoming more in the world, more engaged in what's actually going on. Without any political or spiritual analysis, just raw and live. And then that's led to moving to Spain during these years that we won't name, of the the medical dictatorship that's unfurling before some of us unbelieving eyes, some of us wearily cynical, knew it was coming, didn't quite know it was going to take this particular form. Although now that it has, it's like, why didn't I guess? Why didn't I predict that? It's kind of obvious. But yeah, so our move did time with that, but not consciously. When like, oh, here it comes, better move to rural Spain. It was just good timing. And so that's it, really. Just that, I'm doing a lot more stuff than on the internet than just podcasts and selling books. But I'm also doing a lot more stuff that isn't on the internet. And I'm really keen to meet others who know which way the wind is blowing and who know how late it is in the day. And, without getting all zealously apocalyptic about it, get a little bit apocalyptic, and ready for the rubber of paranoid awareness to hit the road of back to the land practical solutions.
My side channel is very much made possible thanks to my Patreon community. Now, this video was kindly supported by Raw Daughter, Bo Ado Mushroom, and Yerka86. Do you want to choose a topic I focus on next on this channel? Would you like to ask a question for my regular AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out which guests are coming on Thorinquiry next for those long, interesting but unique interviews. Do you want to take part in an exclusive, never to be released discussion with me privately? Well, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today via the Patreon link in the description box below.